Okay, today is March 5th, 2008. We are sitting in the house of Jacqueline Jackson doing a second interview today. How are you doing, Jacqueline?
Doing fine.
Great. First thing we wanted to do was to start off by having you read the first chapter of your book.
Okay.
If that would be all right with you.
This is stories out of a much larger work that's still in progress but is getting close to being published, called The Round Barn, and these are stories from The Round Barn. And the second book, More Stories, starts out the same way, so this is the same first chapter, which goes like this. That's called the prologue. There is the land. In the center of the land are the farm buildings. In the center of the buildings is the round barn. In the center of the barn rises a tall concrete silo. On the side of the silo are painted these words, the aims of this farm: good crops, proper storage, profitable livestock, a stable market, life as well as a living. And signed W.J. Dogan. Jackie could read these words before she could read. She said, "What do they say?" And her sisters read them to her, or a hired man, or whoever was there. She learned them by heart without trying. She did not ask what the words meant. W.J. Dogan is Grandpa. He had the words lettered there inside the barn on the silo when he had just built the round barn. That was 1911, when Daddy was 9 years old. Jackie sees these words every day, sometimes 20 times, on a day when she and Craig and the others are playing hide-and-seek in the barn, sometimes not for several days in a row. But add up the times she has seen them and the days of her life, and they will come out even. Jackie is 14. She sits on the arm of Grandpa's easy chair. She rumples his thinning hair and shapes it into a Cupid doll twist. This is a ritual with all the grandchildren ever since they were little. Grandpa laughs with his stomach silently. An idea strikes Jackie. She takes a pencil and paper. These are always near Grandpa, for Grandpa is deaf. They are always near Jackie, too, for Jackie writes things down. Maybe she has this habit from writing for Grandpa all her life, being his ears. She writes, "Grandpa, I am going to write you a book. I am going to call it The Round Barn." Grandpa studies the paper. He takes a long time to ponder it. Then he nods slowly. "The round barn," he says. "Yes, the round barn will have a lot to say." He crinkles all over his face and laughs silently. He is pleased, she can tell. "I can write," Jackie says to herself, "what the round barn sees. Not just what I know it sees, but what Grandpa knows it sees, and Daddy, the milk room, the milkmen, the cows, all of us. For the round barn is in the middle of us all, and it sees everything. It is the center." Jackie thinks, here are the circles of the book. She draws a picture, starting with the silo and going out to the barn and beyond. And we might be able to show that picture somewhere. And it starts with the silo in the middle and then increasing circles until I get out beyond the town and the milk routes and that rural electric meeting in Janesville where Daddy told the joke. "That's it," says Jackie, "if it were just flat. But the book isn't flat, just as the barn isn't flat." She takes another sheet of paper. She draws another picture. It looks a bit like the round barn, but without any hip roof. It looks a bit like three-dimensional tic-tac-toe. And there's a picture of that. And the arrow's going to it. "It's like this," says Jackie. "We'll go back and forth in time, and wherever we are, it's the present. Here's where Grandpa is young," and that would be 1890s. "And this is 1911, when Daddy was 9 and the barn was built. And here's when Daddy and Mother were married. Here's where I was born. Here's when we moved up the road to the new farm to Cheynou when I started 5th grade. Here's where I am now, in 9th grade. And all this is what goes on while I'm writing and all the years after." For the circles go out concentric in space, but they also go up and down in time, like an onion. But not like an onion completely, for onion parts are too cleanly separated. They pop apart. It's more like elm wood. Elm logs can hardly be split, for the fibers interpenetrate from ring to ring and bind all the circles together. The story, the farm, Jackie decides, is like a log of elm wood. Everything in all directions, in all dimensions, is bound together. And that's my prologue, my first chapter to both books, and it will be to the big book too.
Great, thank you very much. You know, while we're on the topic of your book and having you read this, why don't we talk about your professorial career and how you got into writing and things like that. So to start off, obviously this was one of the first pieces that you wrote, or one of your first ideas for writing. Where do you get a lot of your inspiration, and where did it come from at such a young age?
Well, I think that the fact that everybody was readers and we had lots of books around, and I was an early reader, and it seemed to me that that to write a book was about the grandest thing you could do. And my folks went away for a couple of weeks when I was in 3rd grade, and we kids were left behind, and we all decided to do a surprise. And my brother decided he'd get over his lisp, which he did. And I forget what my sisters did, but I decided I'd write a book. I had a blank notebook, and there's always been something about blank paper that invigorates me, inspires me. So I wrote a book, and it was mostly little pieces, little short stories. I'd put in it, first of all, a poem I'd written in 2nd grade, and that started it, and then there were all these little bits and pieces, mostly fairy stories and elves and things like that. I wish I'd written about the farm, but I didn't. I had a 6-page mystery story. That was my major work in that 3rd grade book. And so my folks were pleased and impressed when they got back, and I entered it in the Todd Show hobby show. Todd's, not the Todd School, no, the YMCA had a citywide hobby show, and people could enter their hobbies. And I entered my book and won a blue ribbon on it, and I was the only person who had entered a book. So the next year I entered a 2nd book, and this progressed a little. It was a continued story about a pair of dogs, Bumpy and Billy Bones, and they were doing adventures of the sort that either I had done or wished I had done or would like to. And some of those were farm adventures. I mean, we did sail on the creek, but we weren't allowed to when it was in flood. Which was the only good time. But the ditches were pretty full, so that we could drag a huge piece of wood over and, you know, get ourselves thoroughly wet and tipped and so forth by sailing in the ditches when there were really floods. We should probably stop the phone, but let's just let it go. It'll ring 4 times and then it'll quit.
We can just pause for a second.
Yeah, we'll wait.
We'll just let this part out.
It's usually a what you call it called?
Touching, aren't they?
Oh,
The microphones, I want to make sure they're not touching, because
you
you're going to get a boom, boom.
you should thread it up underneath, because your audio is going to be in less.
There you go.
Okay, that's better.
That's better, okay.
Now what we could do is take the phone off the hook, and it'll make some blips for a few minutes, but then it won't ring again.
Should we do that?
We could, as long as it's okay with you.
It's all right with me. I don't care if I get any calls this morning. Mostly they're soliciting. Just lift it off. Lift just lift the top off, and then just leave it, and it'll remind me with some bleep 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 bleeps that is off, and then it'll quit, and then it won't ring again. And the ones that are the loose ones won't ring either. I think nothing will ring, and they're out in the kitchen anyway. So if they do, we won't hear them. But I don't think they will with this one off the hook.
Okay.
So.
Do you need to wait for it to...
So it should beep in a second, right?
Pretty soon it's going to discover it's off the hook, and then it's going to go beep, 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 beep.
Get another mic. There it goes.
There it is. It's telling me it's off the hook.
Okay, we know you're off the hook.
Yeah.
I don't remember what we did last time. Did it ring at all?
No.
I don't recall
No,
that it
never
did.
rang.
Didn't.
And I don't think it was off the hook. But I've been getting many phone calls from the Natural Resources Defense Council, and I don't pick them up. What I should do is pick it up once and say, look, you guys, I will send you a check and take me off your, because it's on some, it must be on some sort of a circular thing
Probably.
where I keep coming up.
Yeah.
Well,
And,
if you send them a check, they're gonna call you again.
Well, no, I'll tell them to take, I said, I only will answer by mail, take me off your phone thing. And if you don't, I'll never send you anything again, even though
There
I
you
believe
go.
that you're an important thing. That's the Bobby Kennedy one that is fighting by law for the Alaska wilderness and all the other good things that we're not preserving. It's rather beeping longer than I thought it did. Ought to be done in a moment.
It does eventually stop, right?
Oh, yeah. There's a quit.
No?
This is Mike Maniscalco. It's March 5th again, 2008, and it's a little bit after 10 o'clock, I believe. And we are sitting in Jacqueline Jackson's house. This is our second interview, third try. And how are you doing again, Jacqueline?
Doing fine.
Great. You just read us your book, and we were talking a little bit about your writing career and how you got started in that.
Okay, well, I'd mentioned that I had this third grade book that was inspired to do it as a surprise for my folks. And then I went on and wrote some other little stories and a continued book, Bumpy and Billy Bones. Entered that again in the citywide hobby show and was again the only contestant, and again got a blue ribbon. And in fifth grade, I did a third book, and this one was a continued story. It wasn't short stories. It was sort of Oz-like in character. Kids went up into the clouds and went through different countries and so forth. And a friend of my mother's, who publishes a paper in Galesburg, Illinois, a weekly, saw it in process. And she said, "Oh, I'll publish that." So she started out publishing my story, The Cloudlanders, and it ran for quite a while, and I sent in my installments. And one day there appeared in the paper a notice on the front page saying, "Attention, Jackie Dogan, authors should not let their publishers get ahead of them. We have run out of text. Send in your next installment pronto." And I was on a trip to Mason City, Iowa with my grandparents, and so they went to bed at this hotel right on the bluffs of the Mississippi River, and I sat up at the little rickety desk and chair and wrote out my next installment and mailed it from Iowa. But I couldn't stand the pressure of having a publisher breathing down my neck, and so I brought my couple down to earth fairly quickly after that and ended it. When I got down here to Springfield, I realized that I didn't have any copy of that. And so I wrote to the press, and they said that their archives were all at Knox College. I wrote to Knox College. They very graciously sent me Xeroxes of the entire thing, and it ran for 4 months, weekly. So that was quite a book. The Cloudlanders, I've since put it together into a little book, and it's not bad writing. It's the plot is picaresque, meaning you go from thing to thing, and there's no real climax to it. Except maybe in the individual stories. I had a few good characters. Well, what I discovered at that point was that I was a writer and I seemed to be sailing in an uncontested sea. But then I got into junior high school and found out that you had to outline, and there were all these rules that you had to do. We didn't have creative writing or free writing or things like that. When I did it in grade school, the teacher always welcomed it and sometimes shared it with the class, but it wasn't anything that was being talked about and encouraged. So I really didn't write much of anything all during junior high and high school, although I must have still had the urge, because it was when I was in high school that I told my grandpa that I was going to write him a book and call it The Round Barn. But when I got into college and began looking at, I went to Beloit College and looked over the offerings for my freshman year, and I had opted out of freshman English, so I didn't need to take a beginning English class, and I had the choice of taking a creative writing class. And I can still recall that surge of joy to discover that creative writing was something that you could do and take for credit, that it was a reputable thing that you could do. So So I started taking creative writing then and had a very good teacher and went all the way through college taking creative writing, even though I was not an English major. And then went on to the University of Michigan, where I worked under a wonderful man named Roy Cowden, who was a very splendid writing teacher and head of the Hopwood program there. So I credit, Chad Walsh was good, my teacher at Beloit, but Roy Cowden was superb. And so that was my training. And he said things to me, not a lot of praise, but we worked very carefully together. And he said to me once, he said, "Write another Alice." And that showed me what faith he had in me, that he thought I was capable, you know, of writing something really good. And I think that he also pointed out one spot in one of my manuscripts where I had said that the sun was resting like a squashed tomato on the edge of the hill. And he pointed out that, and he says, "You are a writer." So with that sort of encouragement, you see. And then I had a story that I'd written in college that I sent around. I got a prize in an Atlantic Monthly contest, a second prize. And I sent around a story, and Harper's kept it for 5 months. They sent it back, and they wanted changes. So I made the changes and sent it back, and they kept it another 6 months, and then they didn't want it. So at that point, I was in graduate school, and I was working with Roy Cowden, and he says, "Why don't you get yourself a good agent?" I said, "I have no idea how to get a good agent." He said, "Well, I have one that's a good friend." So I signed up with this good agent, and the book that I wrote with Mr. Cowden, called Julie's Secret Sloth, which was my first published book as an adult, she took the story from college and said, "I think we'll have better luck with the Julie's Secret Sloth." So the one from college has never been published, but Julie's Secret Sloth was. And then after that, I kept on writing stories and stories for children. People said, "Well, why children?" Well, that's because I began writing as a child, and my children's books were so important to me that I figured there wasn't anything better than writing children's books. And people would say to me, you know, "When are you going to write an adult book?" As if, when are you going to grow up enough to write an adult book? And that always annoyed me, because the best children's books, as C.S. Lewis says, and I've quoted to my classes often, there's no book that's worth reading when you're 10 that isn't equally worth reading, and often far more so, when you're 50, if the book's worth reading at all. And then he goes on to say that the adult palate will tire of creme de menthe, but it never should tire of bread and honey and milk. And I thought that was a beautiful quote. On the other hand, these Round Barn books are for adults as well as children, and my children's books were also for adults. Adults enjoyed them and said that they got a lot out of them. But the Round Barn books have some rough material in them, so I sometimes say to a parent, you know, there's that chapter, or there's something there that you may not want your child to read. These days, though, kids have to be so savvy so early that the sexual stuff that's in there, and the horrible stuff, like I've got a chapter saying the worst thing I ever saw with my own eyes was this dog that had been tortured. And I've had a friend who told me she'd read my stories book 3 times, but the second and third time she skipped that chapter. But the parents usually say, if I mention it to them, "Oh, you know, our kids can handle that." So I think it's a book for adults, and the great big book is going to have a lot of accounts in it of all sorts of things that an adult will probably find better reading. The kids will skim through and get the stories. And the way we published this book was that the big book wasn't finished yet when what became my editor discovered it at a writing conference. And I knew he was editor of Tri-Quarterly magazine, but I did not know that he had anything to do with Northwestern University Press. So when he wrote me after the conference and said, "Would you send me the stories you read?" Because each person who was staff there during that week had an hour to read their own stuff, present their own stuff, and I'd presented a number of stories out of the Round Barn collection. I didn't get around to answering him, and a while later he sent me another postcard, said I'd really like to see those stories. Well, life was busy, and I didn't get around to it, and finally, when he asked me a third time, I stuck them into an envelope and sent them to him, and he called up within 24 hours, and he says, "We want to publish your book." I said, "You haven't even read my book." And he said, "We want to publish your book, and here's the way we'll do it." He said, "We'll do a collection of short stories first, because I know the big book isn't finished. And so we'll pull out the stories, some of the stories, and we'll publish that, and then we'll do the big book." So I thought, wow, that is great. And so that's the way the Round Barn got going. Well, it did very well. They did a beautiful job of publishing it. Reg says that the 2 Round Barn books, he's my editor, he says they're the most beautiful books that the press ever brought out. And he says that he had to fight them. They said, "They're a book about a farm, they're not doing that sort of thing, scholarly press." He said, "Trust me, trust me." So they trusted him, and it was their bestseller as a university press book goes for the year it came out. But the big book is going to be coming out with Beloit College Press with some help from me, from the inheritance from selling the farm, which went under. There was a death of the farm because it's too big, and the big presses, the big university presses now are very wary about taking anything that's that big. And even though agriculture is still the basis of our whole existence, you wouldn't know it. The way we are destroying our natural resources, chewing up our farmlands with what are we calling them, McHouses and all sorts of, we're just wrecking up our planet, and we've got to save our soil and our air and our water because we can't exist without it. And do something about the widening. What's another thing I read a long while ago, that no organism can continue to survive in an increasing circle or something of its own waste products. And this is what our civilization is doing. We are living in an increasing circle of our own waste products. And at this point, I think that a lot of people and even governments, certainly Holland, Spain, Sweden, and places like that, are coming to their senses and saying, or have been for quite a while, we've got to do something. We've got to preserve what we have and increase what we have. And of course it comes down to that we have been such a successful product of evolution that we breed incessantly. And we have huge numbers of people, and we are increasing, and it cannot go on. And I've talked to people, and some of the people you know at the museum, and saying that it's going to come. Population has to stop and come down, and it's either going to be happening by planning, or it's going to be catastrophic. And it may be some of both. But I do not look very happily on what's happening for my children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, unless we can bring the way we live back into the confines of our very finite planet. So there's my lecture on that. Meanwhile, we were in on increasing the food supply and in raising the population ourselves and all this sort of thing.
And with your lecture, we know that you're a professor.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm sure that's, that you've lectured many times as a professor. Can you tell us how you became a professor?
Well, I came in the back door. I didn't get a PhD. You can call me doctor if you want to. I have 2 honorary degrees, one from Beloit College, one from McMurray. But I got a master's, and I had written all these books. And so when we were at Kent State, where my husband was teaching, they needed somebody to teach children's literature and in the English department, and so they hired me as a temporary part-time blah blah blah. I had a long title that meant nothing, and so I began teaching children's lit there. I didn't teach writing there, except at the very last I taught one writing course, which was a bomb. And then we left Kent, and where I had enjoyed teaching children's literature, except that they taught it in a way that I didn't like, which was the students were mostly education students, and they had to keep card files on 200 books. You know, you can't read 200 books in a 10-week term, and so forth. So, and what I wanted them to do was to really enjoy the books. So I tried to work with that. We were in Rockford for 2 years, and there I joined the staff at the University of Wisconsin School of the Air, doing a radio show for kids on writing. And that was called The Author Is You. And I did a weekly radio show on generating. I'd take a topic, and I'd talk about the topic. Sometimes I'd have kids with me, sometimes I'd be by myself. I'd quote out of books and things like that. It would be a half hour long. And then the kids all over the state that were listening to the School of the Air would write in. And I would read what they wrote in and pick out something from every school, and then the fourth program, after 3, would be reading their writing. So the kids were getting instant feedback on their writing, and I would include every class that sent in so that nobody would be left out. And that was a very, very nice job, and I enjoyed it. And then we came down here to Sangamon State University to help start this new university. And when the radio station began down here in '75, I was still commuting up there to do The Author Is You. WHA, or it's now WERN or something. Anyway, the university up there suggested that I do it down here in Springfield. So we started it over, it was then called WSSR. We offered it to the University of Illinois, and in Champaign, with which we had no connection other than that we were a state university too. And they turned it down because they said they had to have everything in the can. Well, you can't have everything in the can. If you're going to read everybody's writing in the 4th week, you're going to record what goes on the 4th program. It doesn't work. So, but here at Sangamon State, they were happy to take it, and so we started here, and this is one way I got to know the whole area around here so much, because all these schools are scattered around. A lot of them are rural schools, small town schools, big town schools, Decatur and Jacksonville and things like that, and we must have had 100 or 90 or 100 classrooms that listened in. And that program lasted for 19 years. And I only quit it in 1995 because, well, several reasons. One is that the state and national testings had become prominent, and teachers were having to teach to the test. And that meant that they were having to write 5-paragraph essays. And as soon as their creative writing began coming in 5-paragraph essays, and from the best kids in the advanced classrooms, I thought, boy, this is the end, because there's nothing more deadly than a 5-paragraph essay for writing. And another neat thing about the radio show was that if a kid couldn't spell, if a kid couldn't paragraph, you could still read it on the radio. And you could read the thought, the germ, the so forth. You could maybe leave out a line if you needed to be coherent. And so they were freed from the constrictions of, say, a teacher or a tester who was filling a thing full of red pencils. I've never used a red pencil on students in my life, either kids or adults, when I was teaching. And then I began teaching writing down here. The second class was a bomb, but just the opposite from the first class, since you're asking. The first class was totally bland. All these nice little young women who were going to be teachers there in Ohio. The second class was just the reverse. Everybody was tearing each other's throats out. And you didn't have to go to class if you didn't want to when we first began. That was one of our stipulations, you know, come if you want to, and we would work out. It was even without grades. I'd have a student disappear for a month because somebody had criticized her poem. And so I was never going to teach another writing class. I was enjoying teaching my children's lit classes, and I was able to do them the way I wanted to then, and to divide them up into classics of children's lit, and history of children's lit, and fantasy, and science fiction, and things like that, which I enjoyed. I wasn't teaching the canon of English Lit. But I was certainly getting loads and loads of students, and we all had a wonderful time. But the second writing, what I realized, oh, here's the story. All these programs I'd written up in Wisconsin, and here I was down here. My publisher, Little Brown, wanted a book. And I had contracted to write a book about writing for kids. And I was going to use the radio programs from Wisconsin. I didn't have time to do that. Here we were, starting a new university, which was 24 hours a day. I had 4 kids. Here was 24 hours a day for that, too. There wasn't time. But I thought, I've got this contract. If I teach writing one more time and use my book for kids as a text, then it will justify taking the time this summer to get this all down on paper. Well, I hadn't gotten more than 3 or 4 chapters into the book, if that many, when I realized what had been wrong with the Kent State blandness, with the SSU tearing each other apart one, which was so simple that I hadn't realized it, and that was, first of all, everybody is afraid and protective of their own writing because it's bearing, you know, they're afraid they're going to bare their souls. And in graded situations, of course, they're afraid of being graded badly or so forth and having to do it right. So everybody's afraid. And the second thing I realized is that in order to get rid of the fear, you have to create community. And the third thing I realized is that the teacher has to be part of that community. Well, as long as I wouldn't even say anything about grades, and pretty soon somebody would say, well, how are we going to be graded after a couple of classes? And I'd say, don't worry about it. I'd say, you're either going to get an A or a B, and if you're not, we'll talk about it. And I'll let you know. So that took away that sort of fear. And then I'm a floor sitter by habit, and I found that it worked sitting in class to sit on the floor. And psychologically, you're not up on the dais. You're not looking down at your class. You're not the authority figure. And I would tell the class, once grades became much more prevalent, I've got to give you a grade, and I'm sorry about that, but let's negotiate it. But I could get rid of being the authority figure by sitting on the floor, even lying on the floor sometimes, and doing all sorts of community things with them, which, and then we'd get into the works themselves. And the classes were very popular, and we've had some wonderful writers come out of those classes that have published books and so forth, and are still part of my, what does over at Illinois Times, Roland Close calls them my posse. I call them my gang or my group or something like that, but I'm part of that group too. And they are critiquing my writing as well as I'm critiquing theirs. And there's another writers group that I go to sometimes, and they say, this one is here in my living room, they say, you're not serious enough. Well, we get good writing done. So I'm just as glad that we aren't serious enough. So that's, and about, as far as being hired as a professor, I got hired as they needed a range of professors down here to begin this new university, and I had certain skills, and what I was hired as was PhD equivalency, because I had some 8 or 9 books published by then. And I don't, this wouldn't happen today, because they're insisting on PhDs, and they are insisting not only on PhDs, but from reputable universities. And that some of these schools that have turned out some very good PhDs in experimental programs or things like that, Albion and what are some of those places? I won't list them. Anyway, I wouldn't get a job now, but neither would some other people. We have a very famous person on our staff who is Charlie Schweighauser, astronomer, English, and environmental studies. He is just now retired, but he's still very active. He works with NASA. Charlie is tremendous. He doesn't have a PhD. He's got an MA from Williams. But he's called on all over the country, and he is really our Renaissance man. So I think that it's too bad now that people like me and like Charlie would not be hired now. And maybe that's the end of that lecture.
Well, that's great.
But in some ways, I think if I'd gone ahead and gotten a PhD, it probably would have killed my writing. So.
No, that's great. It's a very interesting point you're making. You know, it struck me that you went to school or started going to school in a country school, correct? And then you went to a town school. You were
No.
close to a town school.
No, my dad went to the country school that was right on the edge of the farm, and it consolidated in 1923. So by the time I started school, we were being the equivalent of bused into, it was really only 1.5 miles into Beloit, to Todd School right on the edge of town. So I was in a town school.
Okay.
But as I said, we only rode in that big old taxi that I described earlier, so that the town kids thought we were all rich coming in the middle of the Depression in a taxi. Instead, we were all sitting on each other's laps, and you know, nobody even thought about seat belts in those days.
Well,
And
what I was going to say is you've experienced the consolidation of schools, I guess.
yeah,
And you've experienced the consolidation of rural schools into town schools, and you've even experienced, you know, colleges and even other rural schools through your radio program. I was wondering if you could speak on, you know, rural schools and explain to us, you know, your opinions and thoughts on the job that they're doing and your feeling on consolidation.
well, a rural school or a village school lacks certain things that your town and city schools lack, and in poorer states and things like that, where there's the money for equipment and lab equipment and things like that. But I think I mentioned that I have some 40 books from District 12 school in my basement here, which when the school consolidated, Grandpa bought the school for $25 and moved it across the field, and we grew up playing school in that schoolhouse and scribbling on the blackboards and so forth. But we didn't discover the books. I think the books had all been put into the big house and then got moved up to our house, and I didn't discover the books until I began working on this large volume of the Round Barn. But I've got those books all cataloged, and I've read quite a few of them. And my dad and brother and his sister and Eloise down the road, who's given me so much help, they had good books to read and sound science, and and then when I was in 9th grade, that was when the rural kids joined us in junior high school. We had 7th, 8th, and 9th grade, and one of the persons was Esther Meach, and she was going to Zilly School, which was a little ways down the road from us, and was a country school, and most of the country kids went on into Clinton High, but some of them came into Beloit to Beloit High, and Esther was one of those. Well, Esther was very bright, and you could tell that she had had good learning in Zilly School and some of these other, Morgan School and so forth. So I think that depending on the probably on the quality of the teacher that they had, that you could get a pretty good education in a rural school. And it's a bit of a funny thing about Dad. He was bright, and he read and read and read all the time, and yet when he took his exams at the end of 8th grade, as everybody in country school had to, he flunked several of them and had to do remedial work before he could go on into high school. Well, I think he took some time off. He broke both his heels falling down the chute in the Round Barn when he was being hired as assistant herdsman at 12, and so he had plenty of time to study. But what I think is that Dad had certain subjects that he really liked, and he emphasized those in the country school, and others that he probably didn't care that much about and didn't emphasize, and that's why he didn't pass those tests. At Northwestern, he got modest grades, not very good. And his father was always writing him on studying and things like that. He got a job in France at the end of his junior year, went off without taking his exams. Worked a year in France at a place where he became very fluent in French. He was teaching, he had a Boy Scout troop and was doing other things, sort of like Peace Corps work. And this was after the First World War. It was 1923. And he met my mother over there and married her over there, to the consternation of the family back on the farm, who couldn't keep up with it because the mail going back and forth, it would take 2 weeks, and by the time they'd get a letter from him and they'd write back, the whole romance would have progressed to such an extent that, you know, there wasn't stopping it. It was snowballing. And it was a very successful marriage, and Mother was very glad that he wasn't marrying a little French Roman Catholic girl. She was a very strong Protestant, and it turned out that my mother was from Chicago and was overdoing the same sort of work as my dad was. Now, how does that tie in with what I was saying? His grades. It didn't work out that he would go back and finish his senior year at Northwestern. So he lived downtown at Aunt Ida's house, which was right there by Beloit College, and he took his senior year at Beloit College. Well, after doing indifferent work at Northwestern, he graduated from Beloit College as the highest in his class in chemistry, and had a wonderful time at Beloit College. But he was motivated. So I think that that motivation has a lot to do with what sort of education you get too, and both from the student and also from the teacher. So I don't know if that gives you enough of, as far as consolidation of the universities, I have been somewhat dismayed at our becoming part of the University of Illinois, because I think that either we are or they are, and it's probably some combination, and some here fighting it, trying to be a clone of the University of Illinois, so that many of the wonderful features of Sangamon have been eroding over the years. There's still a lot of good things. Well, I could do anything I wanted. That was a wonderful feature. Now, what I wanted to do was good things, and sometimes you hit on somebody that was doing things that weren't so good, but they usually got weeded out. It was a very welcoming school to students who had not been able to finish their educations. And we were a 2-year school we had juniors, seniors, and masters. Well, the last 10 years now, or close to it, we've been including more, we've started in having the capital scholars, and now we've got freshmen and sophomores. And we're having all the freshman and sophomore problems, and so forth. And the older student that was the backbone of the university is being, I think, and a lot of them think too, put on the back burner. And so it's too bad that student is not continuing to get the kind of attention. We have some wonderful modern things, but my colleague Judy Everson said, don't give me smart classrooms, just give me smart students. And the smart classrooms, I couldn't teach in a smart classroom the way I do. You can't get on the floor, for one thing. You can't move the chairs around in a circle, for another thing. Everybody's plugged in, for another thing. I mean, we're the plug-in generation, and my own grandkids are plugged in to my little ones, to their videos. That's what they want to do, watch their videos. It's hard work to get them to read a book. Their mother reads to them at night, and I read to them when I go up. And now that Rachel is reading for herself, I think she may begin to read some of these books on her own that are so wonderful, and not watch, good videos. But, how many times can you watch The Sound of Music and Mary Poppins and so forth? You know them all by heart. At least they're watching the video and they're not watching commercial television, which panders so to children.
Yeah.
Well,
and speaking of your grandkids, you mentioned the last time that we forgot one of your grandchildren.
Oh, we forgot Cressida, the perfect grandchild. Cressy grew up, her parents were divorced. In fact, they weren't married when they had her. And then when they did get married at 3 months, I said, what did you do that for? Well, it was sort of like the path of least resistance, which was that then Cressy got onto Skip's benefits and so forth. But it didn't work out. And so they were divorced. And but she saw a lot of her father and even lived with him for a while when she was in high school, and Jillian was working in another town. But Cress grew up much loved by everybody, and she would come and spend summers with me in Vermont for a month or so. And so she and I had a close relationship, and she was a bright kid and a charming, delightful kid who got along well with other kids and with adults too. And they lived in Nevada, and she wanted to take French and other things and didn't want to go to school in Nevada, but Nevada did something really bright. They gave their tobacco money to their high school seniors, provided they would go to school in Nevada and maintain a B average. Well, to have these days a college education handed to you for nothing is something that's hard to turn down. And so we all assured her that she could take all the French classes she wanted. She didn't have to take mining and things like that, even though that's what the University of Nevada at Reno is famous for, all those sorts of things. So she got a good liberal arts education and a lot of French and Spanish and things like that, went to France in her junior year. Took me along at one point because I had promised her a trip over. No, this was before her junior year. Grandma, you promised. So we went. Oh, she went on several trips with me to to England when I took classes to England, and one to Scotland and so forth. Always a delight with the adults and the kids. I know that there weren't kids on those people that she would meet. And so then she wanted me to take her to France, and I said, I thought we'd already taken care of taking you somewhere with the Scotland trip. She said, but you promised. And everything is cheap right now, because it was right after 9/11. So we went over, had a very cheap apartment with a couple of other people, very cheap flights. She said, I want to do all the tourist things so that I don't need to do them when I get here. So we did all the tourist things. You know, climbed Notre Dame and Champs-Élysées Tower, that one was there, and went to the famous cemeteries and went to the waxworks, did all the touristy things, you know. And then she came over for her junior year and met somebody at the very end of her junior year, talked French back and forth to him all her senior year, went over and got a job in France after that and married Laurent, and now I have a grandson-in-law who is a Frenchman, and Cressy's over in France, and we had a wonderful wedding over there and a wonderful reception over here with the French people all coming out to Nevada and on the shore of Lake Tahoe and so forth. So that's my wonderful grandchild. and my grandsons are all right, but I don't know them as well as I know Cressida, and I've always had them in a clump. And it's hard to get to know them in a clump when they're all jockeying with each other for position. And these two little grandchildren now, I see them quite a bit up in Wisconsin, and I can see them separately and together and so forth. So I feel I'm developing more of a relationship with them, and eventually I'll probably have more with the grandsons too. But they're out in California, so I don't see them. I have friends who have family all around them here in Springfield, and I say, well, you're very lucky to have lots of family around you, but I have to go to the family. They don't come here.
Well, let's talk about, your family. Growing up, you were very involved in the farm, and let's talk about your farm a little more. And last time we kind of left off talking about corn.
Yeah.
And you had a lot of things to talk about corn for us. Would you like to talk about some of the hybrid corns?
Yeah, and I'm not sure where I left off. I'll recap briefly that the history of hybrid corn, the history of corn, there are whole libraries on that. And there's whole shelves and shelves on the corn wars with Mangelsdorf and others trying to determine the ancestry of corn. And it's been pretty well settled at this point that teosinte is the ancestor, if not the ancestor, it's very close. The last I read, which was a couple of years ago, was that we may never know the actual parent of corn, but that teosinte is very close, a very close cousin. And so there's, but by the time Europeans got here, corn had been well developed, and the many kerneled corn, and that and the Indians would be replanting and so forth. and they had developed different strains, and in the same way, the Europeans developed strains by planting what you call show corn. You go through the field and you pick out the best looking ears, and those are the ones you plant. And in that way, they developed various strains, yellow dent and leeming and all those different ones and so forth. But meanwhile, out in Connecticut, a fellow named East and others were working on experimenting with corn, and two students of theirs, I think the name is Brinkley, I've got it written down somewhere, came out to the University of Wisconsin, and one stayed in Connecticut. And this fellow, where have I got his name? Somewhere here. Where's corn here? Wisconsin was a land grant university, just like Illinois was. And, well, one of the things this fellow said, where's his name? Well, I don't get it right here. But the university began working, I think about in 1923 was when this fellow came, and they began working on what became hybrid corn. And the way they did that was by inbreeding. You would take the corn, and since corn is pollinated by many pollens from in an open pollinated field, so the one ear of corn has maybe only 1 or 2% of its kernels pollinated by its own tassel, because the tassel and the silk deliberately by nature don't quite coordinate, so that there is this cross-pollination. Well, they began breeding corn back on itself, tying off the tassel in a paper bag and so forth, and then rebreeding back on itself. And of course they got all sorts of monsters, corn that would run along the ground like a vine, or would have the corn on the top of the tassel and so forth. But then they would pick the desirable ones and keep breeding, and after 7 or 8 generations they had a uniform product. Granted, it was stunted, the corn was only yay high and so forth, but at that point they bred 2 of these together, and what resulted was this incredible hybrid vigor that showed up in hybrid corn. And so this was a fantastic discovery and development. And so the University of Wisconsin, and I presume Illinois was doing the same thing, began, they had all sorts of test plots, and they were developing their own strains and their inbreds, and they farmed these out to a few farmers who grew them, and then the second year where they gave it to farmers was 1934, when they decided they needed growers for these things. And that was when my father and grandfather got in on it. Grandpa, I think, heard about it first. And they went up to the university, and they became one of the university's growers. And so they would take the university stock and they would grow it, and there was let's see if we got here. They would purchase the inbred strains, and they would raise them and make their own crosses. And there was no way that you could save the seed and replant, because you would lose hybrid vigor. And this is some of the fights you're hearing now about Monsanto, that they are making things so that farmers in third world can't replant. They have to keep rebuying seed. Well, I think that it's a complicated argument. In hybrid corn, it resulted in so much more corn. It also resulted in what could be lack of diversity, but at this point they very soon recognized that this was a problem, and have kept the diversity in corn, and of many different strains and so forth, so that they haven't. I don't think there's a danger at this point of losing diversity in corn, although I know that last time I was telling about the fungus, the southern leaf blight, that had been so happily, a gene had been so happily bred into the cytoplasm of the corn, which would make that male sterile, and then you could reintroduce sterility fertility, and you'd have both a fertile and an unfertile corn, and so you didn't have to detassel anymore to make hybrid corn. And that was it could have been a catastrophe. If the weather had been different, the United States could have lost its whole corn crop. As it was, the weather was not so terrible. In places, the figures I have is that the United States lost about 15% of its corn crop to the southern leaf blight, and we certainly had it here. It was my first year here at Sangamon, started in the fall of '70, so that I was seeing those August and September cornfields that were just totally black, the leaves and everything. And gradually, as I would get up to Wisconsin to go up to see my family, things would look better and better, and by the time I got to Wisconsin, it wasn't looking too bad. Although in Rock County, they did have leaf blight in a certain percentage, but it was a low enough percentage that it didn't affect things too seriously. I'm wondering why I can't find Brinkley's name here somewhere, or whatever it is. It's such a well-known name. Well, I've got it somewhere else. So I guess that's what I was talking about here. A geneticist told me that southern leaf blight, he said, was a strange situation. He said the DNA of mitochondria of a corn cell had a lesion in a gene that made it susceptible to a new race, in quotes, of southern leaf blight that could attack plants with this form of cytoplasm. And it was called TMS, Texas male sterile cytoplasm. And so they had to quickly breed that out because it was something that was was a very danger. So I've talked about the development of the corn. I don't know, as I said, that our land-grant colleges were started by Abraham Lincoln in 1865. You must know that. That in his last year and before he was killed, he started the land-grant colleges. And I've talked about the inbreds, and we were able to develop. You see, you could develop corn that would fit your growing season. You could develop 110-day corn or 120-day corn through these sorts of things. And I've looked over our own. Where's our own hybrid? Dogan hybrids. Where are we here? That isn't it. Here I am bowing out of your picture here. There's the depression, there's power. Well, the Dogan hybrids, I can say some things without looking it up. The first year we raised just a little bit and detasseled it by hand and harvested it by hand and shelled the corn into a blanket so that the corn was protected. And then when that was planted, it was really remarkable in the difference between that and open pollinated. And I don't remember if it was that year or the following year. It was either 1934 or 35 when Grandpa and Dad, who were always the educators, held a big field day where people could come and see what the hybrid corn was and compare it to their own corn and so forth. And so these corn yield trial days continued right up until Dad was out of the seed corn business, and they became more and more gala and would be advertised in the paper, and sometimes 1,000 farmers would come. And the university always had its test plots. And one year, Dad gave a very funny speech about, he had gotten his hand caught in a husker, which was a stupid thing to do, he knew. But the corn was going up up the elevator into the corn dryer area, and he was pulling husks off as it went, but it didn't occur to him that the husks were also on the underside of these rollers that were going up. And so he reached to pull a husk from underneath and got his fingers caught, got his other hand in there. They stopped it immediately. Anyway, he was lucky he didn't lose fingers. He was lacerated. He was all bound up with his hand. So when the corn trials day came and the Grange would come and would have a lunch on the grounds, and he would raise they would raise corn from, say, 55 competitors, and the university would have about 120 of their own strains that were raised. And then these would all be husked out with a pile behind that wasn't husked and a pile in front that was, and the pedigrees in front and so forth, so that people could go along and could compare them or could try to see how the husking was and so forth. And then people, for instance, in '52, I think it was, they had 3 different professors that came down and gave talks during the day. They had the FFA, Future Farmers of America, had a swine judging contest in the morning, and then the swine professor talked, and then the soils professor talked, and then a corn professor talked that day. And that might have been the day they had the congressman that came and talked too, and it turned out that there were 5 others that were running for office that showed up, thinking that this was a good place to be if you were running for office, was to come out to the Dogan farm on the corn trials day. But Dad had to introduce people and give a speech. Well, he had his hand all bandaged up, and he said that was from defending the fields from raccoons. But he went on with some detail about it, because he said, now in an ordinary cornfield it doesn't matter if the raccoons and the pheasants get a little of the corn, you know, so you lose a little of the corn, so what? But if you've got your competitors' field corn growing over here and that's what the raccoons eat, why, that's terrible. And if you lose a university plot. And so he went on to tell what they had done, that they had, I forget the first thing they did, but the second thing they did was they put wiring out and had radios all around. And then Dad said, and so the raccoons enjoyed music with their lunch. And so that was one of the things he said, and everybody laughed at that. And then and what they finally had to do was to hire people to patrol the fields at night as it was getting closer, to keep the raccoons out, so that they wouldn't lose any of these specialty plots. If it wasn't specialty plots, as I said, it wouldn't matter that much. So that was a very funny speech, and I have that speech written up, and of the raccoon problem. At Farm Progress Days in '61, there was the same problem with raccoons, and unfortunately the person in charge there, who was a kid, well, he wasn't that much of a kid, he was in his early 20s, he finally got permission to shoot the raccoons because they were making such inroads on the corn that was going to be shown for Farm Progress Days, with people coming from all over the state. So but I think the raccoons back in '52 got away easier, were just scared away. I think they tried pots and pans at first, and that didn't work, and the radios didn't work, and it finally took people. So those are, so that was one of the things that we did with the corn. I talked to you about detasseling, I'm sure. Let's see if, oh, and then at first when they dried it downtown at Ida's house in the basement, and would make a kind of a sling where you'd put an ear of corn and then cross over the cord, and then put another ear of corn and cross over the cord, and another, till you had it 10 high, and then you'd hang it, and it would and you'd have a whole bunch of these, and every ear was numbered. You knew what ear was what. And when the corn was dry, then you would make what they called a corn dolly, which was big squares of thick cotton material, marked off with a wax pencil into 100 squares, and put a corn kernel from one ear of corn on a square, and that was that you knew which corn it was. And then when you had a sufficient number of these sheets of these squares of material, you'd roll it up and wet it and let it go for several days, and then you'd open it up and see the germination and see how much germination you were getting from your corn. Well, the first time they did this, they, with great anticipation, opened up their corn dolly, and the first row was fantastic, 100% for germination. The second row had one that didn't germinate, 99% germination. Then they continued to unroll and became more and more dismayed, because the further they got in, there was less and less germination. It was getting very bad, and so they rushed up to Andy Wright at the university, and he burst out laughing. He says, "You've made your corn dollies too big." He said, "They have to have air to germinate." So Daddy and Grandpa came back very sheepishly because it's something that they should have known. And so then they did make their corn dollies smaller and got a very good rate of fertility. Well, the next year they moved it up into the basement of the big house at the farm. And I think I did mention that they increased the amount of fields, and they had local boys that were detasseling, but then it got too big for that, and Dad put an ad in the paper, and here all these kids came streaming out from town to detassel for 25 cents an hour. And a lot of them found the job too rigorous for them. But let's see, were there any other funny parts about the detasseling, or about the corn business? The thing about these, there were a lot of these farmers that the university enlisted to help. Many of them, both in Illinois and Wisconsin and roundabout, developed their own companies. But those dwindled due to various things. For one thing, they began to patent, the big companies began to patent their strains, and there wasn't this free interchange going back and forth between all these smaller companies. And so Dad quit in 1971 when things were still doing very well. But since then, the smaller companies have dwindled and dwindled, and the figures I had is that there are now just 8 big companies, major companies, DeKalb, Pioneer, Pfister, Funk, that account for 70 to 80% of the hybrid corn that's being raised. And most of the corn has been squeezed out. And did I give some of the reasons for that? I gave one of them there. The university was not making public its inbreds, and so that was difficult. And then agribusiness, as I said, was patenting their commercial, so that it became lonelier and lonelier to be a corn dealer or hybrid corn dealer. And now, of course, it's very lonely indeed. I don't imagine there's too many of the small companies left. So there's Brink. That's the guy's name. I said Brinkley, but that was the guy on TV, isn't it? It was Brink. R.A. Brink, who, and both of them had been students of East, and Jones had stayed in the East, but he brought it to Wisconsin. And by 1929, over 150 experimental hybrids, hand-pollinated, and had been tested by the university, and it was in 1933 that they decided to open it up to the local farmers to grow and help them test. So that's some of the stuff on the corn.
Now, do you remember as a child how the neighbors of your father and your grandfather, how they reacted to these new innovative types of corn being brought into the farm and tested?
I think they pretty much all went with hybrid corn.
Really?
As soon as it became very obvious how much greater yield you would have, that even though the open pollinated corn cost a lot less, and you could even take it out of your own fields, if you paid, well, I think one of the figures I had was back then around 34 or 35, the open pollinated was $2 a bushel and the hybrid corn was $7 a bushel. Well, for $5 more, you could vastly increase the amount of corn that you had, and with no more labor, really, because to tend an open pollinated field was no greater than, was no less work. How am I putting it? You could raise the hybrid corn as easily as the other. It was just the initial cost of the seed. You still needed to cultivate and do all those sort of things. So, and I'm sure that that people like Grandpa and Dad that both advertised and educated raised the level of awareness, certainly around southern Wisconsin, so that, and northern Illinois, so that hybrid corn was pretty much standard, and you'd drive along the highways and you'd see the signs out in front of the fields. I think you still see them now. You can tell what's Pfister and what's Funk and what's DeKalb, and so forth, and say, oh, what a, what a fine field of corn, or what it is. One of my funny stories is that Dad had some 640A, I think it was, corn growing at a corn husking contest up in Walworth County, and there was a big storm, and in the night he was thinking, what's going to happen with my corn? Is it going to lodge, which means fall over? And so he got up at dawn and drove up to Walworth County to where the fair was and looked into the field, and sure enough. And you see, for one thing, too, you see, they had made channels in the corn so that the horses and the wagons and everything could get through for the detasseling contest. I'm not detasseling, the corn husking contest, which made it even easier for the wind or the whatever it was to get in there and knock down the corn. And here was his field with all the 640A signs up around it, 641, whatever it was, flat. And so he pulled up all his signs and put them in the car so that nobody would know that that was Dogan's 641A that was lying flat on the ground. And then when he went to the corn husking contest later in the day, while he walked along behind, I suppose, whistling with his hands behind his back and listening to the huskers saying, this blankety blank corn, we can't get at it, it's down here on the ground. And but these are the things you breed for in corn. You breed for increased yield, and you breed for stronger stalks and roots and leaves, and you breed against pests and funguses. And there's another something or two in sweet corn. You breed for increased sweetness and for length of time for the sugar to turn into starch. They've really got that down, so that the corn that you buy in stores now is almost as sweet as when you pick it right out of the field and eat it right about there. They've been working hard on that up at the University of Wisconsin. I know the Lambert, I think it's Lambert that's at Wisconsin, who was a sweet corn expert and was telling me about it. So those are the sorts of things that they were trying to develop in hybrid corn, and managed it very well. I'm not sure whether open pollinated corn is beginning to come back with this sort of back to the basics that's going on now in the food world. I keep getting things from my nutritionist daughter, and there was one just last week. She was comparing open pollinated with the hybrid corn. And I said, well, this is all very interesting. I said, I'd like to know more about it. I said, but you grew up on hybrid corn. So that was one. Let's see if I've got anything more here on corn. I was going to mention the marketing of it. Dad ended up with about 80 seed salesmen, and he had a seed boss, and they'd go around to all, and these men, you see, would sell hybrid corn, and so they were all advocates of selling corn all over, and they were in northern Illinois and in Wisconsin, and he even had one as far as South Dakota. But it was around that area, northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin mainly. And he had 80 of these people who sold corn. Well, he also would advertise, market his corn at the fairs, and there were plenty of fairs. Every county had its county fair. And so he had a corn boss and a marketing boss and his wife, and they'd set up at the Dane County Fair and at the Walworth County Fair and the Rock County Fair and so forth. The Dogan tent, I have here a Dogan hybrid bag. When we developed our own strains, when Dad first started out, he went with a group of Wisconsin growers called Wisbred. They banded together. But after a while, he decided he wanted to go it alone. And so he developed his own strains and his own, which he named. And he made his own bag, which I think is very handsome. I wouldn't mind a room papered in Dogan bags like that for the hybrid corn. I do have some of the cloth bags, but not very many of those. More of these big, heavy paper ones. So, and my brother, in the summertime, helped in the corn marketing, and he would go to these fairs. And he, at the Dane County Fair, the first time he was there, he went with, they would go out to the local farmer and dig up some of his corn, which would look good, and they'd bring it in, and put it on either side of the tent, plant it. Sometimes it grew and stayed fresh all during the fair, sometimes it didn't, but they'd have the name of the grower out in front of it, and it was somebody local. And it was very good advertising. And then they'd have, when the corn was harvested, they'd have bushel baskets around of this person's corn and this person's corn and this person's corn. And they always had plenty of chocolate milk and orange drink and things like that for people. And Fanny and Roy Veman were hospitable, and everybody enjoyed, all the other corn salesmen, DeKalb and everybody else would end up in the Dogan tent because they were having such a good time over at the Dogan tent, which was Fanny and Roy. Well, Craig had a good time too. But at this Dane County Fair, it was the first time they'd been there. And Craig, see if I've got this story straight. Craig had to dig the holes for the tent, and the ground was like cement, like clay, and he had a terrible time. And when they came back the next year, Roy told him where to go, and Craig was dreading digging at the Dane County Fair again. And Roy said, "Here's where we're going to put our tent." Well, it turned out that Roy had the exact same spot as the year before, so the ground was all nice where it was, so Craig was able to dig it up easily and erect the tent at that point, and that was and so Roy said, "Well, it's not just on account of this," he said, "but people know where the Dogan tent is, and so the farmers and other people will come there." And there were various fairs that he didn't much care for the Rock County Fair, not because it wasn't a good fair, but it was just like home. He'd grown up on the Rock County Fair. One of his favorite was the Trask Bridge Picnic, which was an Illinois fair down near Pecatonica. And this started out as a sort of a one-day community affair by the Burkett or something. Grange started it. I don't think I have that name quite right. And the whole community would come, and they would have fried chicken and things like that. Well, it grew and grew, and eventually got to have 3 grandstands or platforms, and on one platform they would have a band playing, and on another platform they would have a politician talking, and various acts on these various platforms, and then they had all the other farm stuff and the farm machinery and things like this at the Trask Bridge Picnic, and it was only one day. But it was great fun, and when the politician talked, they would turn off the band so that people would hear the politician that had come to talk at the Trask Bridge Picnic. And I always liked the name of that. I never went to the Trask Bridge Picnic, but I've always loved the name of it and what Craig had to say about it. But his very favorite was the Sandwich Fair, which is here in Illinois. And that one had a small gauge railroad that ran all the way around the edge of the fairgrounds, so that when Craig wasn't working, he could ride the railroad round and round and round the fair, and he enjoyed that very much. And in what year was it? They had the corn. Fanny and Roy would stay overnight. They had a little trailer behind, and they always had coffee on for people in the tent and so forth. And they would stay overnight. Well, this particular night, and it was at Freeport. Freeport. There's Sandwich. They'd gone home. This was certainly before '52, because Craig was still working there. And a tornado struck that night they had just by, who knows why, when Fanny talked to me, she says, "I don't remember why we went home that night." But they'd gone home, and a tornado came through, and it destroyed the whole Dogan tent and their trailer and everything, and most of the fair. It just almost obliterated the fair there at Freeport, and I'm sure we could find it in the paper as to the exact day and how much damage it did and so forth. And so after that, we still had a tent and things that we put up, but didn't do it quite as fully as we had up until there was this Freeport tornado. So that was the marketing. And then in 1971, when Dad quit the business and really retired, his letter to his seed people said, how does a kid get to be 70? And that's what we're all wondering. Yeah. Here, I'm hitting my thing here. How did I get to be this age? I don't know. You stay so much the same inside. You grow in certain ways, but I still sit on the floor. I still like to slosh through the snow and tramp and make it splash and things like that and so forth. And here I am this age, you know, how'd I get to be this old? It's happening. So,
Wait, tell us about the fairs as being a way of marketing seeds. What other forms of marketing for hybrid seeds did your father and grandfather?
well, he had these personal farmers that were the dealers that would go around and talk to other farmers. I mentioned those. He used radio ads. He advertised on the radio. He also advertised in the newspaper. We had a regular weekly ad in the paper, which was either a Dogan baby or a Dogan a class of school kids that came out. But during the season where he was selling seed corn, he would run a series of ads of his dealers, for instance. Say, here is what was Bates's first name, Roy or something like that. It wasn't Roy, I think. And he is our man in Clinton, and he is selling, and here's what he's selling, and here's what you'll find. So there were the newspaper ads too. And I don't know as they blanketed the state with leaflets or anything like that. But the word got around, and he had, I think, as much business as he could handle. And what would happen if you had a bad field or a bad growing season or something, somebody else might have a better field or a better growing season, and then you could negotiate with that grower, Nichols or somebody like that, to have so much of their corn and so forth. What you would do is you would, once the corn was harvested and it would be graded. They first graded it in a little hand cylinder thing, but once we had moved up to Cheynou and they had fixed up the corn, they fixed up the corn processing before they fixed up the house. We couldn't move in at that point. It was all being processed up there. Had a grader that would have grids and it would shake it through. And this was separating the corn into different sizes. Now, it didn't make a bit of difference if you had a flat or a round or various other gradations when you planted it, but it made a big difference with the corn planter, because the corn planter at that point had not been developed enough to be able to separate out and plant only 3 to a hill. So it might get lodged with a fat one. And the farmer also didn't want to, well, it wouldn't work. What the farmer would do was he would buy, say, a sack of flats, and then he would have only one grid for his corn planter. And if he had another kind of corn, then he could change that grid and plant rounds or something like that, so that the corn had to be divided all up into the different things that they were. Well, after they were all divided up, I forget at which point in the corn dryer you would test the corn for its moisture content. And I liked that for the couple of years that happened when we lived at Cheynou, because there was a little machine down in the basement where you'd put the corn in. I don't know if I told about this last time. And you'd put in oil, and then you'd boil the oil, and it smelled like popcorn. And then the vapor would be funneled off into a measuring device, and you could tell how much vapor there was, how much water content in the corn. And when it got below 12%, then it was dry enough. And then it was dry and could be, they would put a fungicide, rake a fungicide into it, and then put it into these 56-pound bags. What's that, 1 bushel? I forget. Anyway, they were this size bag. What does it say? I don't know. Yeah, 56 pounds. And then the university would come and certify it. They would take samples out of this bag and that bag, check to be sure that your corn was properly dry enough, and then they would put a little metal tab on the corn that, if it was broken, meant that the corn had been tampered with. After a while, after only a couple of years, they developed a way of running electricity through a certain amount of corn, and the electric charge would then be, the resistance of the corn would indicate how much moisture there was in it, and that could be calibrated. So you could just do in a moment what before used to make the house redolent with all these things. And you'd think that corn would be good eating, and we'd try it, but it wouldn't be. It wouldn't taste very good, even though it had been boiled in oil and and so forth. But it did make the house smell good. But that was a bit of a tangent from where I was going. The university. When we first moved into Chez Nous, the big house, the house up from the farm, we didn't have any place to store the corn. And so there was a room right next to the living room, which became the corn room. Dad reinforced the basement underneath it, and that was filled with corn bags right up to the ceiling. There was about this much space up there, and us kids, I was 5th grade, Craig would have been 3rd, Pat would have been 7th grade. Joe was too big for it, too old to the sort of sport. We would crawl up on top in that little space up top and play and read and talk and drink chocolate milk and do different things up there in the corn room. Well, at one point we discovered these little tabs and discovered that they snapped. So we snapped a whole bunch of the corn and my dad just had a fit. That here this certified that this corn was ready to sell, and now we had ruined it. So he had to have the university come and recertify it again from us kids doing that. And so we were no longer allowed to play in the corn room. And the year after that, we had a corn storage building built, and at that point the corn all went in there, and my mother used it as an office, but it was never known as anything but the corn room. For all the years after that we lived at Chez Nous, that was the corn room. So, but we tore off those certification tabs. So that maybe says maybe enough about the marketing of it.
Yeah. Last time before we ended, we gave no credit to the cows. And, that was a large business that went on at the farm and is the purpose for the round barn. Can we kind of talk about some cows some more, and maybe start off with the birth of calves? I know that you have.
Didn't I talk about that last time?
You gave us a couple quick versions, but.
Well, okay. We were all much involved in breeding and artificial insemination when that came along, which was coming along about the time I was born. Not really. That was when the high index bulls were beginning to be known about. I talked, I think, about Parmalee Prentice and the Mount Hope Index and how my dad got all excited about that, and we took all our cow records and discovered what bulls had been doing a good job and what bulls had not been, and then got rid of the bulls that were not sending on good milk-producing genes to their daughters. Did I mention Lochinvar that came out of the West?
I don't think so.
Remember Lochinvar? Well, that was one of my dad's jokes, really. He discovered that we had a bull that he had gotten from Nebraska, I think, and it was supposed to be a good bull. But when he named it, it had a pedigreed name, but he called it Lochinvar because it came out of the West. And there's a line in a poem of Sir Walter Scott's that is, "Oh, young Lochinvar has come out of the West." And so he named this bull Lochinvar, and Lochinvar proved to be a poor bull when Dad did all this figuring. And so he had to send Lochinvar back to the West because he proved not to be a good bull. Anyway, a cow is inseminated either by artificial insemination or by a bull, and often the young heifers they might have a bull running with them at the start. When we became an associated farm where the breeder's service was trying out bulls, but they'd have to get a record on them, they would have these associate farms where they would provide bulls, and they'd run with the young heifers that hadn't freshened yet, and then they'd be able to begin to get a record on the bulls themselves. And the farmer who had these would luck out. I mean, if a bull turned out to be a very good one, they'd have been banking the semen, and then that would be good, and his herd would be improved. If the bull was so-so, why, he wouldn't have hurt his herd any. It would only be if the bull was a poor one that he might have brought down his herd some. But the chances were good because these young bulls they would send usually had several generations of breeding ahead of them, which meant that they were improved. So anyway, you get your cow, your heifer or your first heifer or your cow, and it takes about 9 months, I think it is, for a calf to grow, and then the calf is born. The dropped, I think, is the term they use, and it usually is a drop from the cow's vagina down onto the barn floor or the field or wherever it is, the barnyard where she is, and the cow then licks the calf, and licks off the membrane if there's still some of that anyway. Licks the calf dry, which I think I did say that's a funny thing, that licking will get something dry, but it's true, it does. And the cow, if it's in the field, the other cows come and stand around and watch this, and also the cow tries to hide her calf. That's also where eating the afterbirth comes in. There would be wolves and things like this in the wild, so that the wild ungulates would eat even though they were not eaters, they would eat their afterbirth to keep the young animal from being eaten by wolves or cougars or whatever happened to be the predator at the time. And back at the barn, what would happen in our barn is that the calf would stay with its mother for a couple of days and be happy, and both of them would be happy. Then they'd be separated and they'd both be unhappy, but that the calf would be being fed the mother's milk for quite a while, at least 10 days or longer, maybe longer, because of the antibodies in the milk for the cow, and then would probably go on to a feeder cow, or be fed whole milk anyway for about 6 months, and then go on to skim milk so that the calf would have it for about a year. Now these are the heifer calves, and I think I mentioned that heifer calves were much to be desired. Bull calves got sold for veal on the whole, and a Freemartin calf, which is one that's twinned with a bull calf, a female with a bull calf, is usually infertile, and it's 9 out of 10 are sterile, so that you don't want a Freemartin. But of course, twin heifer calves, that's a nice bonanza. So then at our farm, the calves went down into a side barn, and they should have been separated because of calf diseases, and now when you see farms where they do have calves, I think I said they have those little rounded calf houses all sitting in rows, and they can't even look at each other. It seems very lonesome to be a calf in one of those little calf houses. On the other hand, you're not in as much danger of, and you can also move them around so that you're on different ground, just like you move pigs from one place to another, so that the parasites and the diseases and the things like that don't stay with the pigs. So the calves grow there, and you try to get them vaccinated and try to avoid diseases and so forth. When they get to be heifers, you try to snub their horns coming up so that you don't have a horn problem. And then when they're about 15 to 18 months old, I think, is when they're ready for a first breeding. And after that, the desirable thing is to have a calf a year, but that's not what happens. It's probably 2 out of 3 years or 3 out of 4 years or something like that. You dry a cow off by cutting down on the amount of feed and on the amount of the richness of the feed, so that the milk begins to diminish. And there was another way of doing it too, besides cutting the feed down. Anyway, you encourage the cow to go dry, and then it stays dry for I don't have that straight. When do you breed it? When does it? I'd have to check on that. At what point do you breed it when it's going dry? Because then you have the 9 months. So I think you probably start to have it go dry before it's bred, but I'm not sure. Some farmer will have to tell you that, or I'll have to look over my notes And I don't know as I have the notes down there, the cow notes or someplace else.
What?
I think that's true. I think there's about bread, and then it goes dry, and then for about 2 months that it remains dry. It's from Wikipedia. I think I got where I got that.
Okay, that sounds good.
What breeds of cow?
Well, the
Or on your
Jersey,
farm?
we never had Jersey. They're the richest milk. Grandpa decided on Guernsey. It was the Dogan Guernsey farm, and that has about a 4% butter fat. I think Jersey is a little more than that. Guernsey may be a little less, 3.5 or something. So our best brand was always Dogan Guernsey Raw, and but after a while we got some Holsteins, and then more and more Holsteins, and then the cows were mostly grades. Grandpa experimented some with purebreds, and he found you paid a lot for your purebred, and the purebred didn't do any better than your grade cow as far as at the pail, which was the determination of how good your cow is, as well as see, my thought is now on bloat on the pail. I'll come back to that in a minute. As well as the butterfat content, and that's what made me think about bloat. Let me take time out here to say one thing about bloat, okay?
Right.
I talked about bloat last time. Remember where we just were. And I told you that that a cow would bloat, and I checked this out. A cow will bloat because it has too high a protein content in the rumen as the first stomach. I didn't say this last time. And this is why in the spring you have to be very careful where you put your cows out to pasture, because young grasses, clover included, Sudan grass especially and others, when they're growing rapidly, they have a lot of protein. And if the cows get in there and they love the fresh new grass and they eat it, they get too much protein. And ordinarily the methane that builds up in the cow's first stomach, in the rumen, is taken care of by the cow burping up its cud. The methane comes with it, and the cow doesn't have any trouble. But if you have too much protein in there and the methane is building up too fast, then it can't get rid of it by burping, and then the cow bloats and dies unless it gets help. And the bloat story I didn't tell, I think, was when my dad was 17, was left in charge of the farm. Is this ringing a bell with you? No. Grandpa went away for a couple of days, left my father at 17 in charge, and he let the cows out into a pasture, and he came back to bring them in for milking, and he said he could hear them from a long way away, groaning and groaning and groaning, and he got there and they were all down, they were bloated, and he was just shocked, and he had nothing he could do. He didn't have anything with him for standard bloat, but he had his jackknife, and the ones that were dead, but he raced around plunging his jackknife into the bellies of the cows that were still alive. And I think that they lost 6 cows or so and saved the rest. Well, he was distraught, of course, and when Grandpa got home, he too was distraught, but he didn't blame Dad. He said, I shouldn't have left you in charge. He said, even an experienced cowman wouldn't know about this. There'd been a frost the night before, and there's something about frost and Sudan grass that makes the protein grow even faster, so that these cows had gotten into a pasture that had just frosted, that was filled with Sudan grass, and had been poisoned, and had bloated. And I recall asking my dad, well, how did you know where to plunge your jackknife? He said, oh, that's easy. He said the cow is so distended that you just put it right there in the middle. It's under the last rib and so forth. He sort of gave the exact spot, but like that, and he'd saved it. Well, then I also think I mentioned the other bloat story, and maybe I should also mention, when we come back to it, the calves that were poisoned, lead poisoned, was up at our place, where the dry calves and the heifers and so forth were kept up there. There weren't any milking cows. And we talked about this grain mill in the floor of the big round barn. And what the herdsman would do is he would shovel corn and oats and whatever into the grain mill, but he would also shovel in from a commercial bag a protein to enrich the protein, and then would grind it all up and then put it into the chute that would, the bin that would have the chute that would go down to the cows in the round barn. But he would also draw off 3 bags that would go up to Ron's place, up to Chez Nous, for the cows that were up there. And what was in this bag of protein was urea, which was very strong protein, extremely strong. Well, the herdsman's son had been helping, and the 3 bags were there by the barn door, and he was doing this with the mixing the grain, and he got called away. And he had already poured in the bag of urea, but he hadn't poured in maybe a bag of corn or something, or a bag of oats or something. It wasn't pure. It wasn't pure urea. But and maybe it must have had some mixed. No, I don't even know if it was mixed. But the farm manager had told the fellow who collects the bags to take them up to Ron's place that there were a bunch of new heifers up there, and so they thought they ought to take 4 bags up. And so the fellow went up to the barn, he took the 3 bags, and then he went to the machine and drew off another bag. So you have the 4th bag to take off. Well, that 4th bag was very, very heavy in urea. It hadn't been properly mixed yet. And then when the Vanderkooi, and then the cows, when they found the cows dying all over the barnyard up there, they also pierced them all. You see, I suppose, I don't know if they had the proper tool at that point, which is a trocar. I don't know how you pronounce these things. It's a circular thing like that, which is called a cannula or a cannula or a cannula. Anybody know the pronunciation? And then inside of it, it's got a stylet, which is 3 prongs, a little triangle, sharp, that goes down into it. And the whole thing is called a trocar, T-R-O-C-A-R. And what you do with that is you put it on the cow and you push the stylet in, and that makes a puncture. And that lets, and the air comes out, says my dad, like a great whoosh, like out of a balloon, that when you puncture the rumen. Well, they managed to save the cows that weren't dead yet on the ground, but the ones that were dead were dead. But then it took them hours to try to figure out what the hell had happened to cause some of the cows to die and the rest to seem perfectly all right. And that's how they traced it back to the round barn and to, and probably the kid who had started the job and then left it and then came back to it didn't even realize that a sack had been taken off and just went on mixing it up and so forth. So they figured out that that was how they killed those cows that way. And to finish up on the bloat, there's another kind of bloat, the vet told me, which is a kind of a foamy bloat in the rumen, so that it's like, well, foam. And so that, and usually the way you take care of bloat is by intubation. You put a hose down into the throat and into the rumen, and then the air can all come out of the hose. But if you don't have a hose handy, that's when you use the trocar and actually puncture the cow, and it doesn't seem to bother the cow. Certainly it's much more comfortable once it gets rid of that huge distension which presses against the lungs and the heart and kills it. But this foamy bloat doesn't seem to work with the ordinary methods of getting rid of it, and what the farmers discovered early on, or the vets, is that if you fed the cow soap, that did something to the foam, reducing it so that then it wasn't a problem. Well, after the Second World War, they developed detergent, or during it or shortly after, and they discovered the detergent worked fine on the foamy bloat, and so they would feed the cows some detergent and that would get rid of the foamy bloat. But what the farmers started to do was to feed the cows detergent regularly as a preventative measure. If we feed our cows detergent, they won't get foamy bloat. Well, that went on just as long as it took for them to start testing their milk and to discover that the butterfat was going down to below 1%. They were getting no butterfat. That there was something about that detergent which would encapsulate the fat globules or whatever they are in the milk, so that the fat was not getting into the milk, and so the farmers were losing the butterfat. So they immediately quit using detergent as a regular thing and only used it when a cow actually had foamy bloat. And this, of course, is one of the problems that we're having now, and which is that we've been feeding our livestock, not only cows, but I suppose pigs and chickens and everything else, antibiotics as a regular part of their feed, not just when they're sick, but as a preventative measure. And as a result, we've been developing staph and all sorts of other things that are more and more and more and more resistant to antibiotics. And so we can thank the animal industry for helping move that along towards what's becoming a really catastrophic sort of thing, when you get all this information about how often you have to wash your hands and how, don't go to the hospital unless you have to, and things like that. We're just too smart for our own good, and this is happening with antibiotics. So where were we when I stopped to give us a bloat discussion?
You left off at Holsteins.
Holsteins.
And their butter fat.
Yeah. Holstein butter fat is less. And when I think it was a little before the Depression, and there were various small depressions before the big one. Anyway, at some point in the 20s or the late 20s, when we began buying milk from other farms, they had Holsteins, and so we produced what we called a blended milk, which was both Holstein, and our main milk was the Guernsey, the premium milk. And then there was this blended milk, which could be sold for less because the butterfat content was less, and the way prices were set at the condensery and milk prices and so forth was by butterfat content, so that the higher your butterfat, the more your milk was worth. So you could sell blended milk and Holstein milk cheaper. And the Holsteins, I think, gave as much milk, maybe more. But also with all the breeding stuff that my dad was in on, they realized that pedigree really didn't mean anything. I think I stopped off just about there, that your purebreds didn't do any better, if as well, as your grade cows, especially the ones that had been being moved up through the various stages of the Dairy Herd Improvement Association, which came before artificial insemination, which gave it a big boost in improving cows. That let's see, we were on the improvement of the cows. Oh, the Holsteins, yeah. That any cow could be a good milker and wouldn't have to necessarily be a breed cow. And at one point, I think we had a couple of cows that were sort of mixed Ayrshire and were the funniest looking things, with red splotches and black splotches and so forth. But by the end of the milking, it was mostly Holstein. We had to give up the grade A raw when the final laws came on pasteurization, and there's a date for that, 48 or 51 or something like that. The farmers, the doctors in town had told my dad to keep on with raw milk, that they wanted the raw milk, they wanted the grade A raw milk for patients, and the hospital wanted it and so forth. But when it came that there finally had to be total pasteurization, that's when we quit the raw milk. Around in the 40s, are we still on cows or are we on milk? Both. They go together, don't they? I've got a date somewhere for when the homogenizer came. And what the homogenizer does is takes those fat globules and smashes them to bits, so that the cream no longer rises to the top, but is evenly distributed throughout the milk. And that's what homogenized milk is. And so people could no longer buy milk once we were totally into homogenization. You didn't get your milk with your cream tops where you could pour off the cream. We even had a little device that you could lower down in that would stop off the edge of the bottle, and then you could pour off the cream and use that for your coffee or cereal, and then below it would be pretty much skim milk. But we'd always have to, shake up the milk like this to shake up the cream with the milk. See, I've got too many topics going at once. I'm on milk, Holsteins, cows. Tell me your last question.
We were talking about Holsteins and butterfat.
That's right, butterfat. I was talking about what the homogenizer did, right? But there came another problem with homogenized milk, and that was that because so often milk was left out on the doorstep of people in home delivery, the sunlight hit it, and to hit an ordinary bottle of milk, there was no problem in change of flavor because the fat globules were big enough that they did not absorb that much sunlight to change the taste. But when you got homogenized milk and there were, vastly increased amounts of surface that could absorb sunlight, then you got a funny taste to your milk, and people didn't like that, and we didn't like it. And so they finally figured out that this was what was causing it, that homogenization was causing it, and this was one reason that the bigger dairies went to paper bottles and so forth, and we had to decide what we were going to do about it, and that was why we went to the amber bottle, because the amber bottle would cut out the sunlight. And after a while, of course, it didn't become a problem much anymore because there was no longer home delivery. People would buy their milk from the stores, and the sunlight simply wasn't hitting the milk, so that it wasn't affecting the flavor that way. But we ended up pretty much with Holsteins.
Now you mentioned a story about poisoned calves.
Oh yeah,
That way.
I don't think I told that one before.
No.
This was down in the side barn where the newborn calves would go after the mother was there. The sawdust, I didn't mention sawdust. The Beloit Iron Works had sawdust that they used for making their castings or so forth, and the sawdust was free and it made good bedding for the cows. And so we would bring out truckloads of sawdust and toss them into the side barn, and us kids would play circus above them, because if you fell from a rafter into the sawdust, it didn't hurt anything. But they also used it for bedding with the calves. And the calves began to die, and they couldn't figure it out. And they had the calves analyzed, and the calves were dying from lead poisoning. Well, Dad went everywhere. He would take the flakes off the windowsills and so forth. They tried everything they could find to see what was poisoning these calves, and they'd lose another calf or two. And it was a dreadful mystery. Well, he was in there just at the right time when the sun was shining through a window down onto the bedding, and something glinted. And he looked down and pulled into the sawdust and pulled out a piece of sawdust which had red on it. And looked at that, and it was red paint. And so he poked around among the sawdust some more, and he found others of those pieces. And then he hightailed it down to the Ironworks foundry or whatever it was, and found out that they had that the wood that they made their castings from, that they would paint the end of the wood with red paint that had lead in it. And then when they were done, there'd be all these shavings, and some of those shavings would have red paint on them, which was not very visible in a whole bunch of sawdust. But the calves, there might have been a sweet taste to the paint or a different taste to the paint or something. The calves seemed to like that bit of paint or of taste that they would get. So they were eating that, and that solved the problem. But it showed me that between that bloat story and the accidents that can happen and the things that you don't know, so many things can happen. And some of them, the vet that told me the bloat story about figuring it out about the urea, he said, there's some things we never can figure out. We don't know what causes them. And this was my friend Dick Nylands that was telling me that story. And never can find out some of the things that happen.
Yeah. Now, I believe when I was reading through your book, there was a mention of theft, cattle theft, especially.
I'd like to find the date of that. I think it had something to do with when the price of meat suddenly went up so high, and everybody was very conscious of the price of meat. I think the only real cattle theft we had was when somebody, or had to be probably more than somebody, came out and actually butchered a cow right in the field and carried off a lot of the meat and left the carcass there. So that was, I've got a little news clipping on it, and I remember hearing about it, but I haven't been able to pin down the date. It might have been in the 50s, it might have been in the 60s.
So that only happened one time?
That's the only time that I can recall that we had cattle theft. We had embezzlement. We had 2 different milkmen, I think, that embezzled, and Dad, they were short-term people. Dad, well, one was a person that was working on the place and shouldn't have, and then there was a milkman, a kid really, and he figured out a way of embezzling, of getting the milk when they paid for it at the door, and changing his books and so forth, and then going back and changing them so that it wouldn't show in the office, so that it wouldn't look like they were coming up short, and so forth. And Grandpa wrote him a 3-page letter when they found out about it and figured out how much he owed and so forth, because he was just about to go into the service, and he began paying back so much out of his check every so often through his parents. And I have the letter from the father, who said that he thought that the blame was partly on my father in not catching it sooner, and that if anything happened to his son in the South Pacific, which is where the son was, that he would consider that the debt was canceled, that he wouldn't pay any more on the debt that was owed for the embezzling.
Do you know how much was embezzled?
Oh, probably came up to close to $1,000.
Wow.
It may not be that much, but it was enough that it was a sizable amount. But at that time, it was during the war, and Dad, first of all, didn't want to believe anything was happening. It was called to his, somebody was saying, hey, something funny is going on. But also, he was losing a lot of workers during the war, and he was on a milk route himself because he didn't have enough help. And so he'd start out at 3 in the morning and deliver milk, and then he would come back and do his office work. So he was working 2 jobs, and he was worn out. It took him a while before he finally got going on the books and began examining them and seeing just where they were different and changed and so forth, and coming up short every month. Yeah. So that was why he didn't catch this fellow. I've got the story in my book, but I've changed his name. Mostly I use people's names. And there was an earlier fellow, and he wrote and told Dad that he'd gotten religion, and he wanted to tell him that he had stolen from him, and he wanted to pay him back. And so he sent him $50, and I've got some of that correspondence, and I think as far as we know, that's all he ever sent. But when my father, he had a little ranch out west, and when my grandfather and mother went out west to see my uncle and to do a little traveling out west, they stayed at this fellow's ranch. And so I think what they figured is they probably took out in trade in living there for a couple of days, what this fellow owed them. But Dad, telling me about it later, said that he didn't think that Metcalf had ever really paid off the debt. But I have Grandpa's files of his private papers, and those letters are in there about, and I think I changed the name in the book on that too, because I've realized that people have children and grandchildren and so forth, and if any of them read it, they don't want to read about this. So you can change the name. It doesn't make that much difference. And mostly I've used the people's real names. There was one fellow who tortured a horse because he was mad at it. And he said to me, go ahead, use my name. He was an ugly guy anyway. He says, I don't care, use my name. So I put his name in.
Wow.
Scogan.
Interesting. Now you just talked about it a second ago, which was World War II.
Yeah.
And you touched a little bit on some of the effects on the farm. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more and that time?
Well, we all had to go on to rationing. Dad or WJ told the hired men that if they needed any tires, they'd better go get them now because they weren't going to be able to get them. And some took his advice and got tires for whatever cars they had, and some didn't, and then were sorry. I told you that we raised hemp. marijuana, and that didn't seem to be any great thing except that it wrecked the machinery that had to work it. Wright and Wagner went back to, gas was rationed, Wright and Wagner went back to horses for their delivery. They were the biggest dairy in town. We didn't go back to horses, but we went to every other day delivery, so that instead of covering your entire route every day, you would cover half of it one day and then the other half the other day, which made perfect sense, except for Burwood Park, where people didn't have refrigeration, and that got covered every day. And then eventually it went from every other day to 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and no delivery at all on Sunday. So that was affected, and then sugar was rationed, and what else? So there was all that. We had to, as a country kid going to town school, I had to stick with the rides that were going back and forth, and we weren't running freely into town affairs, so forth. You went when it was necessary, but you also doubled up if you could, and or stayed overnight. Grandpa and Grandma moved into town at about in the mid-40s when I was in high school, about 1944 or so, and so sometimes I'd do something downtown and then stay overnight down there. So because of lacks of rides, and also by then, as I think I mentioned, I was old enough to ride a bicycle downtown in junior high and high, so I could ride my bike to town if there was something going on. And nobody seemed to worry about my safety. Did I mention that when I would ride my bike home at night in the dark, that I was the one that decided I didn't want to meet a car because it might be dangerous. So when I saw headlights coming along down the road, and here I was, I'd just get off the bike and go down into the ditch with my bike and wait till that car went by, and then I'd get out on my bike and go back on. But nobody said, Jackie, hide out when a car comes along. It would probably have been a friendly car, but I just figured, well, who knows? Who knows who's in that car? So that was one thing about my bike riding.
What about labor during those times? I mean,
That was very difficult. The labor, there were two funnels off for the labor. One was the factories. The factories were, Fairbanks Morse, for instance, went into war work, and they were our hugest factory in town, and they had a big demand for help. And it's much easier to work in a shop, not as interesting, I should think, but it's easier as far as the hours. You know, you have regular hours and regular pay. I was looking over some of the stuff that I'd written, that in one of these, come back to labor in a minute, coming in one of these corn yield days at the farm, the 1947 one, I have a good write-up of that, of what happened there and all that went on and how marvelous the corn was and so forth. And I say that Daddy does not say what a terrible spring it had been, that they didn't even think they'd get the corn in. The weather was so bad. I'm sure I mentioned that bad weather when we talked about drought and flood and so forth. And what my note said was that for some days they would start planting at 3 in the morning and work till midnight to get the crop in. In the windows that they had to get the crop in. Well, that kind of labor is not particularly appealing, especially to a town person, somebody that hasn't been raised on a farm and knows that this is the sort of thing that happens. So the shops were taking people, and then the Army was taking them. And so that the draft was going on, and Dad had special dispensation for farm workers, but in the case, say, of Red Holmes, who I might have mentioned before, he chose to go into the Army, and that was where the sergeant kept saying to him, "You're not a milkman anymore," and he said he didn't know how the sergeant knew he was a milkman once, but he chose not to return to the farm because of the hard work there. So that between the Army and the factories, and then the fact, from then on, really, from the war on, it was hard to get help. And this was another reason for the death of the farm, was the difficulty of getting good help. My grandfather was able to hire college students and had people coming down and writing their theses on the farm, and he was able to get a really high quality of hired man. But by the time my dad was quitting farming, you almost had the dregs that couldn't get a job anywhere else and were not responsible and would come and go and so forth. And the barn was not as sparkling clean as it once, and I would come back and I would say, "Hey, Dad, the barn's dirty," and he would look grim and he would say, "I know it," and things like that. So that to try to, and Grandpa tried very hard to fix a working day for farm help and for the family, where they would not be overworked, where everybody would be able to quit at 6 o'clock at night and would have some rest during the day if they'd gotten up very early for the milking and things like that. And he wrote articles about that and talked over the radio about that in one of his radio talks, and has an article in Hord's Dairyman, I guess, about that, about the farm trying to get life as well as a living, not only for the farm owner but for the farm workers too. And so labor was a big problem, and as the blending of farm and town went on too, you had less and less young people coming for jobs that knew anything about farm work, so that you were having to train them more. So it was harder and harder to maintain a farm as the years went on with the help.
How many farm laborers were working on the farm at a time?
Well, there were usually 6 to 8 that were living at the big house, and then there were those that had their own houses. When we get to talking about the Depression, there's an article that's got that, it's got it in it, and then also I've got it in my notes too, that Grandpa with some pride said that the farm managed through the Depression to support 50 people on the proceeds of the farm, including, this would be wives and children too. But that's a fairly good number for a farm of our size. I think the dairy at that point was about 440 acres, and our farm was about 200 acres. And in the Depression, no, we didn't even have our farm yet. So that would have been the 440 acres of the dairy. So so that was a tangent. Where was my main question again?
How many people?
How many people? Yeah. I never thought of the big house as a boarding house. I just thought that was where everybody lived and where so much of the action was. We had our own action at the little house. We would play with our toys on the floor and things like that. But usually there was so much going on at the big house. There was much more cooking going on in the kitchen and activities, and then the meals when you'd eat over at Grandma's house, where the table, the help ate with the family, and for dinner and supper. I think in the morning people would come into the kitchen, and because they came at different times, the farm workers, the barn workers would come at different times and so forth, and the milkmen that lived on the place would come down and have their breakfast and then go out and load up and so forth, or come back. And so the breakfast was separate. The meals in the big house were at the dining room table with everybody. And there was always just much interest going on, always lots of conversation. And once we lived at Chez Nous, there was always things going on up there too at mealtime. I'm a slow eater, and one reason is because there was always so much going on at meals, and there would be plenty of regular professors down from the university, and if the cow tester was there, or if Chet Hazley was there, who was the Cherry Burrell salesman who sold us all our milk house equipment and stuff, there was usually somebody there for dinner at noon. And so there was quite a lot of help on the farm. And when we get to talking about the Depression, I'll tell you about Professor Duffy.
Still doing good?
Oh yeah,
Right.
I'm ready for more.
One of the things you wanted to talk about, or that we want to talk about for under the idea of farm labor and laborers on the farm, is the 1918 flu.
Yeah, and I wanted to bring that up when we were talking about help, because that was there was the two things, the terrible sickness, and then there was also keeping the business going. And as people probably know, the flu was a terrible, terrible thing, and it killed some 20 million people, wasn't it? Which was twice the number that were killed in the First World War, including all the civilians. Maybe 20 million, that seems like an awful lot, but I think maybe that was it. It was worldwide. And I've got it on a thing here about the flu. What did I do with that? That's bloat. We talked about that. Here's the flu. 20 million. An estimate of 20 million people. More than twice that many than were killed in the war and in civilian killings. And my dad, all of us were often downtown at Aunt Ida's and Aunt Lillian's. Aunt Lillian lived with Aunt Ida in her later years, or not such later years. And Dad would be down there. He went, for instance, when he was going to high school, he would ride his bike back there for lunch and so forth, and we often slept overnight downtown there. Anyway, Dad would play at an evening with the local kids down there, and one of them was Lowell Putney, and they would play under the street light, and they'd joust with their bicycles and sticks and play kick the can and things like that. And when the flu came along, the entire Putney family died. Father, mother, Lowell Putney, and his brothers and sisters. The whole family was wiped out by the flu. And I heard from Eloise, who lived down the road from us when we were talking about things, and I mentioned Dad saying how the Lowell Putney family had died. She said, well, we had a sort of a memorial service out at our house. She said, after the flu was over, she said, I can remember my mother saying, oh, what a bitter, bitter pill that was, and they got everybody together to remember the Putney family, because there wasn't any family to remember them because they were all dead. And so that was one thing, but on our farm and on our road, there was a lot of sickness, but nobody died of the neighbors. Now my father and my brother and grandma, his brother, my father, my uncle, and grandma were sick. Esther was sent down to Aunt Ida's because she wasn't sick. She was the sister. Practically all the farm help was sick and couldn't work. And what was left was Grandpa and one milkman, Charlie Keller, and my Aunt Lillian. And at that point, she was 55, and Grandpa was 50. And Aunt Lillian was rather a trial to everybody, but at least when I was a kid, she was, and she was a trial to my grandma in many ways. But Aunt Lillian came out to the farm. She donned boots, she donned aprons. She and Grandpa did all the barn work and all the milk house work alone. And the way they handled the milk route is that, and Charlie Keller told me this, he said that they would fill up a wagon. There were two routes at that time, east side and the west side of town. And he would go in and deliver the east side, and then he would come back to the edge of town, and Grandpa would be waiting for him with another wagon with the second load in it. And Grandpa would take the first load, I presume horses at this point, would take the first load back to the farm, and then he and Aunt Lillian would do up all the washing of the bottles and so forth, and the bottling of the milk. And then while Charlie was delivering the second one, and then when he would be done, he would come out to the farm and he would help. So I imagine these were 3 a.m. till midnight nights too, as that planting night that I just mentioned. And they had to do the whole thing. I imagine some corners were cut. They might not have kept the barn quite as cleanly as it had been, but the cows got milked, the milk got pasteurized, or yeah, they would have been pasteurizing then, some of it, but the milk got bottled and it got delivered, all during the flu. And when it was over, Grandpa and Aunt Lillian were pretty much haggard shells. They had worked so hard. But for all of Aunt Lillian's being a trying old lady, she certainly, when she was 55, came through magnificently during the flu. But I imagine that was a time when everybody had health problems because of the illness and so forth, and we were lucky that nobody died. Reminds you of the Black Death back in Europe, which is really what opened up Europe to the middle class, because so much labor was killed, died of the Black Death, that here was all this land that then was more open, so that the vassals could move out and so forth, but I won't go into medieval history. But there was that effect too.
Yeah. Let's also talk a little bit about the milk wagons on your farm. And, you know, can you explain what they looked like, what it was?
Well, we have some very nice pictures of the early ones. The first one was Grandpa just delivering in a buggy, but pretty soon he got a milk wagon and had W.J. Dogan, the baby's milkman, on the outside. And the milk wagons, the part that could be painted were sort of rich cream color, and then the printing was in a brown. So it was a nice effect, nice creamy effect. And the early milk wagons were sort of big wheeled and pulled by a horse. And what you need in a milk wagon and in a milk truck is to have a dip so that you can hop in and out and in and out and in and out when you're delivering milk. You can't be opening and shutting the driver's side of the door at any rate. So that the building of a milk truck was always built with that kind of a dip, as you'll be able to see in the pictures. And there was a period, and it might have been during the war, when they had a lot of trouble with the milk trucks, trying to keep them going, and and they were using a Ford where they would have taken out the back seat and had the space in the back seat and the trunk where they could pile milk cases, and they improvised all sorts of things when they didn't have the proper sorts of wagons. But by the 50s, certainly the Dogan milk trucks were all very uniform and quite nice. But when in the Depression too, as they kept adding milk routes, why they couldn't add milk trucks because of the cost too, and that's when they were pressing farm trucks into service and some of these other makeshift sorts of things.
Yeah.
But a milk truck is a specialized sort of truck, and during the Depression we rode in the milk trucks because of not having cars, and the milk trucks had a sort of a central area in them where it was down to the bottom, and then it had two sides up, and you would pile the milk cases on those sides too, and I suppose those sides were up were to be over the wheels. So that was the building of that. But they were always very uncomfortable to ride in because there was a little metal ridge along that part. So that if you were sitting on them, that metal ridge hit you right there in your lower thigh above your knee where it bent, and was uncomfortable riding. But many's the time that we would have crowds of kids riding in those. And I had a Sunday school class that came out to a party, and we had an accident there with the milk truck. I was taking them all home in the milk truck, and this was great fun, and of course no such thing as seat belts or taking any sort of care. And we were heading on the west side, and my brother was driving, I think, and I was there with the kids. And all of a sudden, my brother speeded up tremendously, which was a shock, and then a car hit the truck and knocked the truck over onto its side. Well, those kids were flying around inside like popcorn. Nobody was hurt. What had happened is this man was rushing his wife to the hospital and had run a stop sign, not a stop light. And that we had been in the intersection, and my brother had seen that car coming at him, and that's why he had gone faster and nearly escaped, but at the end, and it knocked us over. And we could have been sued. We could have, all sorts of things could have happened if it had happened now, especially since one little girl was missing. Well, what happened is that we were right close to where she lived, and so when she found herself outside the milk truck, and here was what had happened, she ran home. And so we found her at home, and so then we all breathed a sigh of relief. But the milk truck, once it was righted, it still ran, but it didn't run very well. And it was sort of compressed a little bit. And we drove it back to the farm, and I think it was Aki Berg's truck, and we pulled it into the spot where it was supposed to be, and we put a little sign on it and said, "Sorry." So that one, and then we had 2 farm mechanics, and they kept everything running. And I think I mentioned that during the cold weather, we did get a big garage built finally, where there was some heating, and it would keep them warmer. But until it got warmer, the farm trucks would often, they'd put 2 on that farm ramp that in the picture that we looked at last time. They could be on the farm ramp, and then in the cold weather, they could get a start by running down the ramp. But it really took 2 mechanics to keep all the machinery in repair, and including the milk trucks, and the farm trucks and the tractors and all that.
Now, not only did the milk trucks deliver milk, but there was also an orange drink that I've heard you talk about many, many times.
Oh yeah, we loved that.
Explain what that is?
It was sold in little, well, maybe it was in pint bottles too, but I think it was really just in little half-pint bottles. And it was called Dogan's Orange, and what we would do is we'd buy a concentrate and then mix it with sugar and water and bottle it. And it was very good. The closest thing I'd say it comes to it is if you have a good orange squash over in England, or a non-carbonated orange drink here, because it wasn't carbonated. But it was very refreshing, and we drank a lot of the orange drink. We also had grape. And there were a couple of things that bombed. There was a root beer drink for a very short while, which I don't remember, but one of my sibs said, "Well, don't you remember the root beer drink?" And I said, "No." But I guess it didn't last long enough to be popular. And there was also, I think, a strawberry drink for a very short while that didn't last. But the orange drink and the grapefruit and the grape drink did. And those were in little half-pint bottles.
Okay.
And
Lisa, just one second. We're getting a little close with the microphone. I'm just going to move the Bluetooth up.
okay.
Above this button, so they
Okay.
can't really come into contact.
Okay, was it causing any problems?
I don't-
Or beginning to? Or
It was coming close enough to make me nervous.
okay.
All right.
Okay, we're back.
Okay.
Well, we've talked about the flu, and we've
Yeah.
talked about the milk trucks.
Yeah. The other thing that you wanted to talk about was power on the farm.
Oh, yeah.
And you wanted to...
Okay, now that's a little complicated for me, so I studied up on it, and it's still a little complicated, but I will explain it as best I can. I have a friend, he recently died, shouldn't have, Hap Hornbosel, a genius at anything mechanical and an inventor. And Hap and I crawled, well, mostly Hap did the crawling, but I did a little, into every orifice of the farm to try to figure out what the power was. And we have a gold mine there on that farm still, down in the well, beside the big house, but the people that own it don't know it. They don't know what a gold mine they have down there, and I'm not about to tell them. Anyway, here's what. When Grandpa came to the farm in 1906, they had wind power with the windmill, and they had, that's the wrong thing there. That's here at the end of it here. They had, of course, hand power, hoeing and things like that, and horsepower, and wood. You could burn wood, and coal, and kerosene. That was what there was in 1906. The windmill was used to pump the water up out of the well. And the cows were milked by hand, and the milk was bottled by hand. And what have I got here? And the kerosene provided heat, and so forth. Well, when the round barn was built, Grandpa had it wired to make it ready for electricity, because Beloit was way ahead in electricity. Back in the 1880s, the Warner, A.P. Warner, was a kid, and he told his grandfather, who was an educated and distinguished gentleman at that time, that he wanted to be an inventor, and his grandfather's father said, "There's nothing left to invent," which was a gross understatement. But A.P. Warner grew up to electrify Beloit, really, early on. First in just little areas, and then later more and more. So by 1890, there were some dynamos, and by 1995, what have I got here? And with power from the dam, I think they were providing electric power to about 70 households in Beloit. And from there, Beloit electricity became very much more and more a part of the Beloit scene. So I think that the fact that there was good electricity nearby had something to do with Grandpa deciding to settle near Beloit, because he knew that there would be electric power there eventually, but he couldn't afford it right when he first moved out there. So what he did is he started with a Model Z Fairbanks make and break engine, and that would be around 1910, and dismantled the windmill. There's no more pictures of the windmill. Well, we have a good picture of the windmill in one of the pictures of the big house, and built a pressure tank, and then he'd have water at all times with this Z motor. And then in 1914 he replaced the old jack pump with a motor-driven jack and a generator that was electrically powered by the old Z engine, and now he had power for pumping water and washing bottles and capping and lighting the house and the barn, and belts that drove the sewing machine and the washing machine and all sorts of things like that, and a gas engine in the barn for a shredder, for the shredder, the husker, the silo, and filling and all that. But it was 2 horsepower down there, which wasn't enough for milking. Well, I've mentioned maybe in May of 1914 he had an alfalfa party, and he'd been growing alfalfa in different spots on the farm, and alfalfa was just beginning to come into being a forage crop, and it took care in growing. And so the university had worked with him and was interested in it, and he had this alfalfa party and had people come down from the university, and it was a peripatetic sort of party because people moved around and from field to field, but it was also an electricity party. The Wisconsin Power and Light, if that's what it was called at that point, had loaned Grandpa various electrical items to show for the people coming to this big alfalfa party. And so when they went into the big house, they would see, you know, electric washing machine and vacuum sweeper, which turned out to be a dud later on, but for reasons I won't go into right now. And sewing machine, did I say, and so forth. And the electric lights in the house and in the barn, everything was all lit up electrically. And so the Daily News wrote up this alfalfa party, but they spent a lot more time writing about the electricity than they did about the party, the alfalfa party, partly because, well, I would say a lot because Beloit was not yet totally electrified, and especially farms weren't. And so to come out and here was a farm that was all lit up, and all this power going on with the electricity was something that was amazing to him. So that was 1914, and then in 1916 he expanded again by getting what was called a Freeport gas machine. And as Hap explained that to me, it's a vaporizing thing. It makes a vapor with the gas, and you can draw off the vapor and use the vapor for power, and in the house and the stoves and boilers and things like that, and at the big house, and then in the milk house and the barn you could use it, and then you could use the heavy gas, which it wasn't the vapor, for your tractors and things like that. So it was quite an interesting and economical thing, and it was right out there between the big house and the milk house, and I used to think it was a well. Well, it was a well. So when I wrote a story where I have Jackie sitting on the well cap, when I first wrote that story, I figured that I was sitting on a well. What I was really sitting on was the what's the name of the thing? The Freeport gas machine, which was down in there. And so that was a revelation to me that wasn't a well. That was the Freeport gas machine. And they still used the Z machine at that point. Got the first tractor about 1916 or 17. And then in 1916, the very end of 1916, when so much expansion was going on with building the milk house and Grandpa needing more power and so forth, I mentioned these clay pits earlier that were halfway out Collie Road. where they were making the clay for the castings for the ironworks. Well, they had had electricity come out that far, and Grandpa paid another $600 to have the High Line extended another 3/4 of a mile out to the dairy, and so he then had the water, the light coming from Wisconsin Power and Light, and by the time he had electrified everything with the high wire, it was about another $300. So that was about $900 in 1916 or 17, which is a big sum of money at that time to electrify the place. So although the Perigo founded, in fact, the Perigo clay pits there did it and helped with it by having it go that far. And that brings us back to the labor, because he was, with the electricity, he was able to do more in spite of losing labor. And when we last talked, I mentioned how we didn't use we used horses for the haying, and we went into the forks and things like that. Well, I found in this, the Grandpa wrote this article in 1929. See, what have I got here? He had several systems running at that point when he had the High Line, and he had the 3-phase current that was direct from the city power, and he went from 32 DC to 220 AC at that point in the farm. And so the farm was fully electrified by 1917, and at that point he sold the various separate home plants. One problem with the REA is that a lot of people had those home plants and they didn't want to give them up because they were backups. And the REA wanted people to give up all their home electricity and use the REA in order to make it pay. And they had a hard time with a lot of the farmers who didn't want to give up their Z motors or whatever it was, their generators that they had on the place. And we've covered that a little bit.
What? The REA is the
Rural Electric Association, yeah. Which began, FDR began that, but then during the war, it petered out before the whole country got electrified. But then the whole country gradually did get electrified because the REA went into co-ops and owning by the farmers and so forth and so on. So the government didn't finish funding it. So I mentioned the electricity party that they had in, maybe it must have been in 1917 that they had the big electricity party. Not with the Alfalfa Party, although they had, I think they used some of the electricity there too. I'd have to get that straight. They put the electric motor up in the loft at that point and got electric milking machines because they didn't have as much help to everybody turn out and do the milking at 3:30 in the afternoon or early in the morning. And our first milking machines were 2 Empire milking machines, and they were the kind that stand back behind the cow and have the hoses and the tit cups and so forth go to the cow. And that developed a funny taste. And I think that they had traced the funny taste in the milk to the milking machines because they had German silver in them or something. And so they got rid of the Empire milking machines and went to Surge at some point. So I don't know too much about that. But the Surge milking machines, have I got it here? They're what I grew up with. And this was, you'd put this strap over the back of the cow, and then this would, gotta be careful of my stuff here. This would hang under the cow with the strap over the back of the cow. It was called a surcingle. And then the milking machine would hang on the surcingle and would hang right under the cow. So I think I don't know if the whole contraption was called a surcingle or just that metal rod with the strap, and you could fasten, adjust it to the size of the cow and the heaviness of the udder with the stuff there. So that was the surcingle. Well, let's see. We have the High Line, but then the Prairie Farmer asked the individual master farmers that they had to write about electricity on the farm. And Grandpa wrote them an article, which was about half of the article they probably finally published was Grandpa's talking about electricity on the farm. And he said that that in sum up, he said, we've had electric power since 1940 with a home plant, and by 1917 the high line current came from Wisconsin Power and Light, and in 1929 he lists, we now elevate the grain, we elevate the hay. I told you we didn't use power, electric power for the hay, but we did. And he wrote in some detail about that, how the electricity would, there was a rope that was fastened to something, and that you would hit the switch and the rope would then pull up the hay, and then you could hit the switch and it would drop the hay and send the fork back. You still needed somebody to plunge the tines of the fork into the loose hay, but the electricity did the lifting, and before, I have seen horses do it, and what I think I saw was the horses up at our place. For some reason, they must not have had the electrical setup in the Chez-Nous barn, so that when they put hay into the Chez-Nous barn, I saw the horses walking and then being yelled whoa, and the load dropping into the barn and so forth. So that's where I saw that. But we did use electric power to elevate the grain and to elevate the hay and so forth. So let's see if he says any. He talks about how in the article the disadvantages, he says, are the only real disadvantage is that you have to be very, very cautious, and that you can't let people use the electrical equipment that don't understand it. And so you have to be very careful that your people are trained to use the electricity. So here's where I wrote it. I said, have a hay rope attached to a hoist which runs the electric motor, and when a load of hay comes up, and it's an instant job to throw a switch and get a start, and then a return drum draws the fork back to the load, and you can unload a large load in 10 to 15 minutes with only one man. So that was saving labor. So do we want to come to the Depression now?
Yeah, let's talk about the Depression.
Well, let me come to the Depression because that has to do with labor too. But I want to start talking about the Depression by talking about Professor Duffy, because I've developed a strong dislike for Professor Duffy without ever having met him through what happened. Where's my notes on Duffy here? Duffy, come on, where are you, Duffy? It's maybe with those Depression things I just laid down there. Well, let me.
Right behind you, too.
What?
There's one behind you.
Yeah, but that's the flu. Well, here he is, right? No, that's not it. That's Dogan hybrids. Just a minute. Sorry about this. More corn. Where's good old Duffy here? Corn Trials Day. Well, I don't see it. Anyway, I think I can wing it on Duffy. Here's what happened. In the spring of 1929, before the big crash, there was I've lost my seat. There was a bonanza from the university. Professor Duffy was the professor in charge of farm machinery and implements and so forth. And he had made a deal with 2 implement companies to borrow their machinery and use them on 2 farms and send an assistant to each farm. They would be on loan to the farmer, and he would run this experiment for 3 years to see how much efficient use of machinery could save on farm labor and on everything else. This was his big project. And a farm north of Madison was going to be all case machinery, and he selected the Dogan farm, and they were going to have harvester machinery. Well, here was a gift horse you could hardly not accept. So they accepted this, and somewhere, and I may find it in a bit, I have the list of everything they sent down. And the one that I remember the most is the Ronning silage thing. They had something out in the field that would cut silage and bind it, a machine, but I'm not sure that that was the ronning filler, because what the ronning did was it cut the corn in the field right into silage, so it was already cut up, the ronning filler. Well, I think they got a tractor out of it, and they got about 6 pieces of machinery, including this 4-row binder out in the field, the ronning filler, the tractor, and 3 other things. And they weren't going to begin until the 30s, but they actually did begin in the fall of '29. Before the crash, they were doing something. Well, nobody realized quite so soon how bad things were going to be. And so Grandpa was using and Dad were using the machinery, and the assistant, I don't remember what writing there was about the assistant or who it was that came, but they were keeping the records, and they were keeping how much time they spent and so forth. And after the first year, Grandpa's report to Duffy was that the farm had not made any money. He had all these things. Well, it was the beginning of the Depression, so it's not really surprising. But Duffy wrote him a letter which was like scolding a schoolboy, that here's what you've done wrong. You have too much help, you do this, you do this, and the whole thing sums up as Grandpa as a poor manager, and using too many men for doing these jobs, and so forth and so on. Well, the Depression went on, and Harvester wanted their stuff back. And Duffy wrote after a bit and said that they had not anticipated things being so bad, and they were going to have to call the machinery back. The farmers were given the option, the 2 farms were given the option to buy if they wanted to, but they had to get the machinery back and so forth. So I think that Grandpa somehow managed to keep the ronning silo filler and the tractor. And I'll come to how they got through the Depression, so that they probably they might have had some money to do that too in a minute. But Duffy really, really wanted this experiment to work. And what he didn't take into account was the sort of thing I've told you about, for instance, calves dying, and you don't know why. Well, things happen to machinery. Somebody puts something back in wrong, and the next time it goes, it breaks something. I mean, we all know trouble you have with a lawnmower, for instance. Well, farm machinery is complex, and if you have a worker that doesn't quite know what he's doing, or if they didn't notice when they took it off that it went in this way, and they put it back in this way, and you lose a half a day of work, or you can't get the part, or things like that, and that slows down the work. So that the efficiency that Duffy was expecting and had bet on wasn't coming through, and this was irritating him mightily, and he was blaming Grandpa because Duffy's experiment was not working, and he didn't take into account the Depression either. And Grandpa conferred with one of his older workers who had been with him almost from the start, DeWitt Griffiths, and Griffiths wrote down and said, Duffy was saying how you have to get rid of so many men. You don't need a man here, you don't need this man, you don't need this man, and you can do the work with this. And Griffiths said, it seems to me that what we are regressing to is to what life was like without life as well as a living, where the farm worker would just toil the entire time. And so even though the project was stopped after 2 years rather than going the full 3 years, Grandpa still filled out all the stuff and sent it in to him, so he had all the statistics on it, and he kept the silage, the ronning machine, and he had one funny line in it, in one of theirs, where he was talking about how he had used the machinery on the home farm for, by then did he have the hill farm? He had some other silo on somebody else's place that he was filling. and he said his neighbor had said that he couldn't understand why they had to keep filling the silo and filling the silo. As you know, silage settles. And but he said he finally had it figured out, and that was because there was a Chinaman down on the other end that was emptying it just as fast as he was filling it. And it took me to read that a couple of times before I realized what the joke was, that on the other side of the world somebody was emptying his silo from the bottom. But Grandpa's final letter to Duffy, after all these tart letters from this fellow, is saying, we did not, he pointed out the problems of the ronning. He said the problem with it is that it cuts the silage it doesn't cut it as fine. And so the corn is bigger. In other words, a corn cob might be cut in half or thirds or something like that. And he said, and so it does not mix as well with, what word did he use for the other fodder part of it, the stems and the leaves and all. And he said it builds a much steeper cone in the silo. When you empty it into the silo, it builds a much steeper cone, and that lets the corn roll down. The bigger pieces of the corn roll down and roll to the edges. Well, around the edges, as I think I said before, you can't have air because that interferes with the fermentation and lets the air in and it spoils it. And so he said he had to have 2 men in the silo with the ronning in order to keep shoveling up against forking it up against the edges so that it would fill, because of the ronning not cutting the silage fine enough. That was one of his criticisms of the ronning. But then in his final letter, I don't know if that was contained in the final letter or not, but he finishes it up saying that he guesses that this has not worked out well for him for Duffy and him for 3 reasons. And one of them was that he used too many men, especially customers who were out of work who would come out and work off their milk bills. And I myself am probably lazy and do not work hard enough. And he had one other thing. Anyway, he sort of dug his, this is the last letter, he sort of made a dig at Duffy as to why he had so many, he said, and because I have not laid off any men. Because he didn't lay off any men all during the Depression. He said, because I haven't laid off any men, I have taken on extra men so they can work off their milk bills. And I guess, because I guess because I am probably lazy and do not work hard enough. So that was Grandpa's response to Professor Duffy, who had treated him like a child in these earlier letters and ordering him about what he should do. Which brings me to the Depression. It hit pretty much unawares. There had been other dips before. 1921 was one, and so forth, and recoveries and so forth, which was sort of almost usual. I mean, you knew there were going to be troughs and heights and so forth in farming and in anything. But then when the Depression hit, the Great Depression, it was really bad. And so there were 2 things that saved the farm. And the first thing saved everybody. And see, I've got some Depression papers here somewhere. Where did I put the Depression? Here we are. This might not be all of it. Probably the first major thing that saved our farm and saved all the other farms on Collie Road and saved many farms all over was the Federal Land Bank. And the Federal Land Bank made loans to farms so that they could keep going. But there were adjustments that had to be made. You had to have a certain relationship between liabilities and assets. You couldn't just go in and say, I need this much, and they'd give it to you. Well, the farm was too much in debt to get a Federal Land Bank loan. And I'm pretty sure this was my father's idea, but certainly he and Grandpa chewed it over together. They decided that they would incorporate the milk business and make the milk business an entity in itself and separate it from the farm. And so they incorporated, with Grandpa as the president and Dad as the secretary and his first cousin Hazel, Aunt Ida's daughter, as the treasurer, I think it was. The three of them were the board for incorporating. And then they transferred all the debts from the farm, some $20,000, onto the milk business. And then Dad went around to all of his creditors and asked if they would take a note on the milk business. And all the creditors did. He said if the creditors had all called in at one time their bills, what we owed them, he said we'd have gone under. He said, but they didn't. They trusted us. And they did not call them in, and so that saved us. They took private notes on the milk business, and he said, Dad said that everybody on the road would have gone under if it weren't for the Rock County Federal Farm Loan Association. And he said, and he probably told me this about, well, it would have been in the late 60s or sometime during the 70s. He said, we got ours in 1933, and I'm still paying it off as slow as I can, because it must have had a very low interest rate. And so he was hanging on to that. Well, here's what was happening with the milk business, of course, which was that business was falling off. That people were being laid off, and they would quit taking milk, and or they'd go to the store, they'd get it, or they would take a bucket out into the country and get it from any farmer who was willing to sell them a bucket of milk out of his cow. And that cow could be tubercular, or it could be who knows what. It could be unclean or so forth. And Dad wrote a series of rather humorous ads called Dear Blaine, where he talks about carrying your bucket out from the milkman, carrying your bucket out to the country and coming back with your milk. But anyway, so the milk business was falling off. And so Dad would write courteous letters, and I have some of those letters, to customers suggesting could they pay just a little bit, and so forth. And some could and some couldn't. And then, as I mentioned, they could come out to the farm and try to work off their milk bills, some of them. But still, things were really going downhill when Dad had his second great idea. And this was not immediate. I mean, this was not one that he hadn't had earlier, which was there was a motto in Wisconsin that said, farm and factory must prosper together. And he had used that motto when he had sold milk. He'd gone up to Gisholt's in Madison, which was peddling milk into Gisholt's factory. Or maybe they were a dairy there. Anyway, he went up into this Gisholt's place and saw how they were doing it. And when he came back, would that have been before or after? Anyway, he had, at the start of the Depression, he was selling milk to a couple very small shops. Would stop by and leave milk for them and so forth. And so then he decided he was going to really, really push it. So he went and got contracts with the Iron Works and with Fairbanks and with Warner Brake. And was Warner Brake there at that time? No. What else was there? The Iron Works, the shoe factory. I went through the shoe factory behind the milkman when I was 9, which was what I wanted for my birthday. And it was an incredible day. Anyway, he began selling milk in the factories. And yeah, well, it was during the war that he sold to Warner Brake. That's a separate story. So in South Beloit. So what this did by selling in the factories was that the men would have their milk there at their machines, and would take a milk break and so forth, and then the milkman would collect the empties the next day, and it was putting milk where the people were that were working. And then the milkman would encourage the person that was working to take milk at home, and the person would. And so by selling milk in the factories and by being able to tap the people that were earning money and were willing to buy milk at home, the milk business went from 2 routes at the start of the Depression to 6 at the end. And so Dad's comment was, as soon as I had said that we as kids didn't recognize that there was a depression going on. I mean, didn't everybody ride in a milk truck in preference to a car if they had the choice? And didn't everybody wear hand-me-down clothes? And we always had plenty of food on the farm. There was everything enough to eat on the farm, and we didn't have to move in with relatives, and we didn't have to have relatives move in with us, and we didn't lose the farm. So it was a while before we kids realized, you know, sure, money was in short supply, but before we realized the seriousness of it. Whereas Dad's comment when we were talking about the Depression and all of this, as he said, well, once we got selling milk in the factories and began building up the milk routes, he said, I hardly knew there was a depression going on too. But the farm was so close to bankruptcy that I have all the bankruptcy papers that my grandfather drew up. We had the rich relatives down in Elgin, I mention every now and then, and Uncle Neil was a banker. And he and W.J. had outlined the whole bankruptcy procedure. So the farm was just teetering on going bankrupt, and that also brings up the story that I've told you about the mouse in the churn and whether or not they were going to send the milk out. And the farm was so into cleanliness that at any other time, but at a time of deep depression, of course that butter would have been fed to the pigs, but not at that point. It was just too much on the razor's edge. Was the farm going to go under, or wasn't it going to go under? That Dad had that hard decision, which he decided, certainly according, it would have been a wrong way to Grandpa to decide to send the milk out on the route, I mean the butter. But Dad sent it out on the route and then suffered for it for a long time, and as I said, never told anybody till he told me in his 90s that he had once let butter go out that had been churned with a mouse. And reminds me of green eggs and ham. Would you like it with a fox? Would you like it in a box? Oh, I think one of them is, would you like it in a house? Would you like it with a mouse? Well, how do you like your butter, with a mouse? You know. So that was the Depression. And then, of course, towards the end of the Depression was when the war work began. I mean, that's what sort of pulled out the Depression, and Fairbanks went to making war locomotives and things like that, and so the farm was pulled out, and things were splendid after that. And when we had the 6 milk routes, that's why I was able to go on the milk route, every day with Roscoe, and we'd do a different milk route every day. Did that mean we had 7 routes then? Anyway, we had quite a few. And we held that right up until the time that Dad retired from the milk business. And then, as I said, it was only a few years after that that retail milk delivery just crumbled all over the country.
And I want to come back to the retail milk business and things like that. But one of the things that are kind of synonymous with the Depression is hobos. And I know you've written about them a few times in some of your books, and I know there was a train
Yes.
going across your farm.
Well, we had a train track across the end of, at the very end of our property, but then Grandpa bought a field beyond. And so you had to go over the tracks to get your cows into that field, or to get your equipment in there if you were raising grain or alfalfa or anything in there. And there was also an underpass where the creek ran through. So that was always a fascinating place to play. Well, during the war, during the Depression, I can recall that my father at one time said that he had to wait for a train down at where it crossed down Collie Road, and he had counted 100 hobos or 200 hobos sitting on the boxcars. Anyway, huge numbers of them. Poor, out-of-work guys trying to get from one part of the country to another to see if there was any work out there. And when I imagine some hobos came to the door, and that Grandma would feed them and so forth. But the story of the hobo that fell off the train was that down in that back pasture, right, or near the back pasture where the train tracks went across, and where we sometimes lost some cows, because if the gate was left open, or if it sprang open or something happened and a cow wandered out onto the track, a cow catcher doesn't save a cow, all it does is sort of shove it aside, but it kills the cow. Anyway, and I don't know whether diesel engines at some point even had cow catchers, when it wasn't necessary to catch cows anymore. But Ernie Capps went down to get the cows, and came back green and told Dad that there was a hobo down there that had fallen off the train and had been cut in half. And so Dad tells him to take the farm truck and a couple of gunny sacks and go down and get him, and he'll call the funeral home, which he did, and which Ernie did. And in my story, I have an exchange which I'm pretty sure happened. Sometimes these things, you know, you remember the exact wording where the funeral home said to my father, "Are you sure he's dead?" And my father said, you know, "Are you sure he's dead?" And Cap says, "Look, Ron, his legs are on one side and the rest of him is on the other side. Now you tell me if he's dead or not." And so then he went down and he came back with 2 gunny sacks with this remains of this man in it, and by then the funeral home was out there and had picked him up, and I think it was in the paper too that later that a hobo had been killed, and whether they traced who he was or so forth, I don't know. But the way I finished my story was also the way that Dad told it to me, which is that Ernie went off to hose down the truck because there had been body fluids that had come out onto the... Oh, he had also said that the train tracks were just as slick as, you know, totally clean from the amount of wheels that had gone over him after this guy had been hit. And so he went off to hose off the truck, but before he left, he had said, you know, he didn't know why me. And Dad said to me, he said, "I don't know whether he was meaning why me in the universe was the one that had to discover that body and clean up after it, or why I, Ron Dogan, the boss, hadn't been the one that had to go down and take care of that situation." And he said, "I guess I mumbled something about, well, you know, that's the advantage of being the boss." But he said it was not one of my finer moments. But the hobos were all over, and my uncle actually rode the rails himself. Trevor was out of a job. He graduated in 1928, and then he had a job with in Waukegan, or had a job with Power and Light up in Madison, and was laid off. And when he was traveling trying to find a job, he was up there with those hobos. And he said what they would do is they'd be up by the coal car, and there would be kids alongside the railroad with bags, with gunny sacks, and they would throw coal down from the train to the kids on the ground. And the kids would peg apples back at them. And so it was a nice exchange. The kids got the coal that they needed, and the men on the trains, riding the trains, got the apples that they could eat they'd catch them when the kids threw them up. So that's the story there. And there were itinerant workers that came and would work for a day's pay and so forth during the Depression. But I think that Grandpa had all the help he could use, and Dad, along with it was the war where there was such a lack of help, because in the Depression there were so many unemployed people that were willing, like the men that owed for their milk bills, that were willing to come out and work.
Were there a lot of men that owed for their milk bills that would come out and work, or?
I think there were probably quite a few. I don't think that Grandpa would use them all at once, maybe two or three at a time. And during times when there was a buildup of work, like silo filling, when you could use a couple men in the silo rather than one, and things like that. There are slack times on a farm, as you know, and then you have to keep in mind what you can do with slack time, like getting ice out of the river is a slack time job. You got to get the ice the right thickness and coldness, but then it's a busy and hard working time to go and cut ice.
What about, and I'm not sure if this actually fits into the time period of the Depression, or it might actually be after, and this has to do also with gender roles, but there's a story about Miss Egan.
Oh yeah. Miss Egan was before the Depression.
Okay.
And she's a woman I would have loved to know. And I've just been going over the Miss Egan files, and I was actually going to give you people the Miss Egan files because I thought you would find it fascinating. I'm sure there were plenty of women that were working on farms, farm wives that would go out and help pitch bundles and things like that and so forth, but we didn't have anybody working on the farm, any women farmhands. And Grandpa got a letter in 1928 from Humphreys, who was in charge of something or other, husbandry, animal husbandry or something up at the university, that Miss Josephine Egan had inherited a farm and that she had been up there for their short course, but needed more experience, and he recommended some time on an actual farm, and would Grandpa be willing to take Miss Egan to work on the farm. And at the same time, Grandpa got a very nice letter from Miss Egan explaining how she had been in teaching school, but that she and her brother and sister had inherited this farm, and she was the one that wanted to work it, and would like very much to come down, and knew that taking on an extra person might be difficult, so she would understand that too. But Grandpa took her, and they put her there in the big house, and she was very personable. They enjoyed her, and from reading her letters, I know how personable she must have been. And I grew up hearing about Miss Egan, but I never met her. I was born the same time she came, and so I was a baby. And Grandpa put her on to doing everything. He had her working in the barn, he had her working in the milk house, he had her, plowing, and instead of staying 2 months, I think she stayed more like 6 months working on the farm. She had talked about 2 months. And then he gave her a great deal of help on her farm in Amboy, Illinois. And I've always wanted to stop by and see if that farm is still there, or to look her up in the city register or something like that. I've never gone out of my way quite driving north to pull over to the west where Amboy, Illinois is. But there's these letters back and forth where she would be telling him what was going on and asking him advice. And he came down and brought plans for building her silo. And they built, I think it was a tile silo, not a cement silo. And he gave advice on they ended up with milking shorthorns for her farm. And so she has lots of discussion in her letters about breeding, and she shows great affection for her cows. She describes one as saying that such and such has just had a white calf with black eyelashes, very chic. And then Bonnie, who they'd been waiting to calve, Bonnie had a calf, but she died. The heifer died because the calf was very, very big. And so that was a sad note. But there were other things, and if the heifer's gotten out and has been bred twice and hasn't freshened yet, or whatever the term is at this point, should you breed her again, and if so, to a special bull or whatever, these sorts of things. So she and Grandpa have these letters back and forth, and you can follow the progression of Miss Egan and her farm from our place, which is really awfully interesting. And at least once, and maybe more than once, Grandma went down with Grandpa. And the letter preceding this is one where I laughed out loud, because she says, I am so delighted that Mrs. Dogan is going to come down next time too. Tell her that I too am house cleaning, but I have so far only managed the attic and the cistern. But if she would like a clean place to stay, she is welcome to stay in either of those places. And so that made me laugh and made me think, from all these things that Miss Egan has written, she must have been a splendid person to have on the farm and to know. The incident at the very end is a true incident, except that I made up the last sentence, and I might have said that it took me a while. The book is, the stories are creative nonfiction in that you do make up some dialogue. And I've probably mentioned some dialogue, like when Grandpa broke his leg and Grandma says, whatever's going to happen to me next after this big terrible accident on the next farm, and so forth. And I've had other people tell me exact words that have been spoken at times of crisis. So that I've been able to put those in the book, those exact words, but then you work around it the way the people would have said something. to make it more interesting in conversation and so forth. But I had discovered from the records and with talking to Dad that when Grandpa got down there once, he found a tractor on her records that she'd been depreciating for years. And he said, "Where's this tractor? I don't know where this tractor is." And so she led him down behind the barn and showed him whatever this tractor was, and here it was in terrible shape, and vines growing through it, and weeds and so forth. And he said, "But Miss Egan," he said, you can't do that. He said, "You've been depreciating this tractor for years." And that's what I put in, what he would have said. But then what would she have said? And that's where I had to make it up. And I must have tried, a dozen or more different responses from her until the one I got, which my dad also liked very much, which is where I have her putting her finger up and rubbing it over a corroded lug on the wheel of the tractor and saying, "How can you put a price on an old friend?" And so that was the line that I finally came up with. Sometimes lines come to you right at once, and are perfect, and sometimes you have to work at them and find the perfect line. But I'll give you Miss Egan's records, and you can look through them and see if you would like to use anything there, because this is an Illinois farm in Amboy that she that she took over, at which time I think maybe 10 farmers had been using it, or maybe it had been her parents or her father or something, and he died, and that's how they inherited the farm.
Very interesting. And to follow Miss Egan, I mean, she obviously kind of broke the role of what a woman would do on a farm.
Oh yeah, she was big news for a week or two, all around the neighborhood. That she was working on the farm and was in the barn and so forth. But then everybody got used to her, so Miss Egan wasn't big news very soon. She fit right in, and people accepted her. The other farm workers accepted her.
What was the normal role for a woman on the farm?
The farm house and the housework, and filling in when things were tight. I know the farm girls, the ones that I knew in 4-H, and this Esther Meach that I've just mentioned, and others, they were all out there raising pigs, and I was raising this calf in this disastrous time that I fell out of 4-H because I wasn't trained well enough to be a 4-H'er. So that, but how many of those young women went on to own farms or to become partners, I don't know. I think they stuck more to the women's sphere. And of course, after the Second World War, I'm sure that during the Second World War, there were a lot of women out on tractors and doing everything because of the lack of help. But that after the war, there was this tremendous pressure to get the women back into the house, into the home. And I'm sure that was the same for farms too. And that, if you were taking a man's job, you were made to feel guilty, because here were all these men that needed jobs and had come back from the war and had served their country, and so the women were pushed back into the household sphere.
Now, being a girl growing up on the farm, were you? Now you had one brother, and I've heard you say in the past that he was kind of the one that was supposed to be the heir of the farm.
Yeah, it was always just assumed that Craig would take the farm. But then Craig developed bad sinuses, and he had to go out west, whether this was the proper cure for him or not, or whether how much it helped. But he spent 2 winters in Arizona, where it was dry on account of his bad sinuses. But he would work on the farm in the summer in all that dust and so forth, and he was, always taking his nose drops and so forth. And so that it never occurred to my sisters, certainly, and certainly, well, not to any of the 3 of us girls, that in any way would we be taking over the farm. And Craig had still not made up his mind when I graduated from college, and he was at the end of his sophomore year, what he was going to do. And he hadn't decided, actually, until his senior year, what he was going to do. And at that point, Dad talked over the whole farm business with him and his health and what. See, Grandpa earlier had been urging people onto the farm, but I have some documents from Grandpa saying, I'm not so sure that it's a good thing to urge young men now to go onto the farm because of what's happening on the farm. And I need to date those documents. I've seen them just recently. I was reading one just recently. So Dad and Craig discussed long and hard whether Craig should be a farmer or not. And it wasn't that Craig wasn't interested. He knew the ins and outs of things, and he knew what a hard job it was, and he saw how hard his father and his grandfather worked. And he had spent his summers working on the farm. I mean, he detasseled with me, and he went on the milk route one whole summer, so he knew the milk route end of the business. And he did other sorts of work. He did when the fairs came along, he was doing all of those. And I suspected that even while he was in school, he helped with the fairs on the weekends and so forth. You might be interested to know that Wisconsin won't start school until after Labor Day. That's on account of the fairs. Too many farm kids and too many people are out at the fairs up until after Labor Day, so that there's no point in starting school until after Labor Day. That's not true here in Illinois. So Craig decided in his senior year that he was not going to take over the farm, that he was going to be a doctor, which meant that he took one more year at Beloit College. He took a fifth year at Beloit College getting all the chemistry and biology and stuff that he hadn't had, and then he got accepted to the University of Wisconsin at the medical school in Wisconsin, and went to medical school and became a very good doctor. But this left the farm with nobody to inherit it. Well, Dad had been grooming Gilbert Gilbrand Gestvang from Norway. He was the first worker that came over from Norway, and he jumped the gun on the American Scandinavian Foundation. This was starting after the war, which was sending over Scandinavians, because there was such a gap during the war when farming had not been able to progress because of Nazi occupation and everything that was going on. So the American Scandinavian Foundation had a situation where they would send over two boys, two men, young men, every year, who would work 6 months on a Midwestern farm and 6 months on a Western ranch. Now, whether they sent more or whether we just got the two that were Midwestern, I'm not sure how big an operation they had, but we had two every year. And Gilbert knew this was coming up. They Americanized his name, the men did. And so he came over ahead of time, and he went up to the university. No, he got a job on a farm in Stoughton, and he didn't much like it. And went up to the university and talked to the university people, and they said, oh, well, go talk to W.J. Dogan. Go talk to Ron and W.J. and see if they've got room for you on their farm. So he went down and talked to them, to my grandfather and father, and they hired him. And this would have been about 48. And the Scandinavian program, I think, didn't get underway until about 49 or so. Well, Gilbert worked a couple of years and was splendid, and everybody loved him. And then he went back home and married Solveig and came back and brought Solveig with him. And they lived at Chez Nous in the rooms upstairs for 6 months or so while they were fixing up the apartment over the milk house, and then they moved down over the milk house into that apartment. And Dad really had in mind that Gilbert would be farm manager and then would buy him out and would have the farm and the business and all that. But the problem there was that Solveig was homesick, very homesick. And the object of the American Scandinavian Foundation, Dad paid the foundation paid the men. So he wasn't directly paying the men, he was paying the foundation. Although in the case of Gilbert, when he came back, I think pretty much that was between him and Dad. Solveig was homesick and wanted to go back to Norway. And meanwhile, Gilbert was such a prize that they knew that in Norway too. So they kept offering him jobs. And finally a job came along that was so good, and Solveig was so homesick that even though they had 2 American-born little boys by then, that they left. And I think at that point, Dad pretty much felt, well, by then it was, I don't know if he saw the handwriting on the wall or he used a series of farm managers after that, but he didn't try hard to figure out the succession of the farm at that point, or to get somebody that would have been similar to Gilbert to do it. So that was too bad. But the way things worked out with the spreading out of Beloit and what was happening in farming is that it would have been a bad. It wouldn't have been a good situation even for Craig. I mean, the hybrid corn business for small hybrid corn growers went this way, and the milk business dissolved because of the home delivery and so forth. And you would have ended up as the people that then farmed our land all the time up until Dad died were raising corn and soybeans at that point. And hybrid sweet corn, I don't know if they were raising hybrid corn, but Shepherd was raising hybrid sweet corn, so he had that. But being a farmer, a small farmer, was not, the heyday was gone from that. It had been going up, 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 and then it began to diminish. And so when Gilbert would telephone once in a while from Norway and chat with Dad, or Dad would call Norway and talk with Gilbert, and Gilbert was always saying that he really, really loved it there at the farm and should have stayed, Dad would say, no, you shouldn't have. You know, you should have taken this good job that you had at it was a co-op running a potato factory of some sort or something on a beautiful lake up in Stange or something like that in Norway. I've been there. And so he would assure that Gilbert that he had done the right thing. And I think he did the right thing in not pushing Craig to become a farmer. And by the time that Craig had decided not to be a farmer, I was already married. My life was going on. There was no, hey, let's pull Jackie back and see if we can make a farmer out of her. And in later years, when I was working on all this stuff, but I was always interested. Dad sent me telegrams when that first embryo transplant calf was born. I don't know who else he sent telegrams, but I don't think he sent them to my sibs. I think some other people knew, but I got the telegram saying, hey, it's happened. We've now done it. And so forth. So I was always knowing what was going on, and I was always spending a month at least on the farm in the summertime, and then at Christmas and so forth, and taking the kids back there and being sure that they knew how to find asparagus in the ditches and watching all the proceedings that were going on, as long as there were proceedings to watch that were going on. And when we got the chance to move to Rockford in '68, I jumped at that, because even though the milk business, the farm was still was fully going still then, even though Muller had taken over the milk business, we were still milking, we were still bottling, we were doing the whole thing. It was just being sold as Muller at that point. And so the cows weren't gone till '69 or so that the kids had 1 year of living just 18 miles from grandparents while the farm was fully going. And then as far as the seed corn and all, it was fully going up through 1970, 71. So they had that. And so I was around a lot, more than anybody else I was around, because Craig got out west with his doctoring. So I was the one that was there the most and that was the most interested. And I always had in the back of my mind that I told Grandpa I was going to write that book, But I hadn't gathered materials until Dad, I think I said, was sick in 1967 and was in the hospital. And that was when I really seriously began getting transcripts, writing things from people and sending out notices, and when did you work on the farm, and can I come and see you, and will you come and see us, and this sort of thing. And Dad considerably later said to me once, he said, if you had taken over the farm, he said, you probably should have been the one to take over the farm, but if you had, he said, would you have written all those books? I said, probably not. So, And as Mike Wyant said the other night, he says, Jackie, he says, you are the farm. I said, well, I guess I am now.
Yeah. There was one other thing that happened that that you've said has kind of ended the farm, and that's Interstate 90.
Oh, yeah.
And I was wondering if you could just talk about Interstate 90 a little bit.
Well, it's been important, of course, to have highways that get people where they want to go and so forth in this modern world. And they needed a superhighway. Wasn't it Eisenhower that started the superhighways? And what I think I heard from Eisenhower about that was that every superhighway had to have every so often a certain stretch of highway that was perfectly flat and uncurved so you could land an airplane on it. I know where that one is on a certain highway in Vermont where you could land an airplane, but that would be the only place on that highway that you could do it. Anyway, the interstate system began, and by my dates here, I think that it came up. They needed one from Chicago to Minneapolis, and so it came up along the old Route 20, and then it curved up at Rockford and went up past Beloit, past Janesville, past Madison, curved up again to Baraboo and Mauston and so forth, and on up to St. Paul and Minneapolis. And they began getting whiffs that this was going to happen. I don't think as early as the mid-50s. I think it was later than that. That this highway was going to be coming through. Anyway, I think by 1958, it was being built, and we have pictures of it being built and so forth. And my sister married Louis in '49, and in '48 and '49, they were making cement blocks for their house, and Grandpa had given them just a little corner of the field up on the edge of the farm, of the dairy farm, where they built their house. And this farm, this road was coming right at them, and they could see over there in Illinois where it had just stopped, and it was pointing at them. And I have Patty's diary, just a couple of sentences here and there, but going along, about the worries about I-90 and the fears about I-90. And what they had realized by then is that the I-90 was going to go up on the east side of town where all this marvelous farmland was, rather than on the west side of town, which was all sandy and not such good land, but it was going to go right through the good farmland, and that the dairy was in the way. And what it ended up doing was clipping off a part of the dairy and a part of the adjacent farm, and the two farmers, with some arrangement and some money back and forth for what little difference there was, swapped these triangles. But Patty and Louie's house went totally. Did I mention when the house was going down and the salesman came? Well, they bought a little piece of land on Collie Road down below the dairy, below Marston's, and rebuilt. This time they did not make their own cement blocks, but they used their same plans. And as Pat said, we didn't, you don't often get to correct the mistakes that you make, but that they did correct the mistakes on the second house, and it was still just off the dairy, just a little ways off, so that her children grew up seeing a lot of Grandpa and playing on the farm, their grandfather, and playing a lot on the farm and so forth. So, but the state did not pay much for, I presume it was the state, and I've got all the statistics on what did get paid for their house and for the land and so forth. And my dad sued, and I think they finally settled out of court and managed to get a certain amount, and figured they would have lost all of it if they'd really taken it on through. But Pat and Lou didn't get very much for their house. But Vanderkoy, who was then the herdsman, decided he wanted the roof. And there was some way that you could have lifted off the roof and so forth, and there was also quite a bit of salvageable material in the house. Well, they were in the process of salvaging this house, and they were pulling out insulation and bricks and blocks, and everything was lying all around, and the place was just in terrible shape, and I don't know if the roof had been moved yet, or maybe he must have got the roof, because there was then a tornado later on, and I saw the roof lying in a field years later. Anyway, some salesman came, and he had somebody that he was training with him. And the salesman came to the door, and here were all the Vanderkoy children, of which there were many, in raggedy work clothes, and here were Pat's children in practically nothing also, and they were either playing or pitching stuff out of the house. The place was just one awful mess. And the salesman said, "Nice little place you got here." And Pat said the fellow he was training looked distinctly embarrassed and had the good sense not to echo what his boss said, and that they left soon after, that this nice little place you have here that was being dismantled in order for I-90 to go through. They made some mistakes building I-90, and I was reading about those in the paper. I actually discovered I-90 it must have been a lot earlier, because it was the winter I was at graduate school in 1951, when I took the Beloit Daily News so that I could keep up with what was going on at home. And I remember in the spring opening that up and spreading it out on the floor, because it came all rolled up, so I spread it out on the floor so I could see it. And here on the front page was a map, and the map was very familiar, except it wasn't familiar. And what it had was the proposed highway going up. So it took from 51 to about 58 to get it really built, so that it was in the air, but it wasn't decided. That route wasn't decided. That was a preliminary picture, but it's one that actually proved true. And that wrecked up the whole end of Turtle Township. And the city kept annexing and so forth. So that was in the sections where I begin saying, here's why the farm died. And I include Craig not being a farmer and taking over, but also I-90 is probably a big factor. And all the other things that have been hitting the family farm, agribusiness, and that you either need to be really big and have farm factory practically, or get out.
You have tons of experience with the family farm, growing up on a family farm, and even with doing a lot of your family research. You know a lot about it, and I want you to speculate and look. What do you think? What do you see the future of family farms now?
Is this the end, or shall I throw in a few things that I did wrong before or said wrong?
We're getting close to the end.
Well, let me mention soybeans. Okay. I did mention too that we had soybeans, right? But not much. And I found something from my grandpa where he was arguing with my father back and forth that he says, you're getting too much into growing seed corn, and that means we're cutting out the small grains. We're not getting as much small grain, as much barley and oats, and so forth. He didn't mention soybeans there, but then I found soybeans on another sheet, so I figured it. And that was when I began thinking, and that was when I called up a sister who shall remain nameless, because she said, don't use my name. I said, I seem to remember that you said once that as a little kid you liked to go and sit naked in the soybeans. And she said, yeah, they were really nice and cool. And she said, they had a good feel to them too. And then she heard what I might be saying. She said, well, don't use my name, so I'm not going to say which sister it was. I said, we all said it. And I might have gone and sat in the soybeans too, but I don't remember it. But it seems to me, on a hot day, to go sit in a nice cool bin of soybeans and pull your soybeans up around you, it would be right. So we did have soybeans. So that was one thing that I had wrong that I wanted to mention to you. And then I did mention to you about DDT, and I found that they actually would sometimes spray DDT from granules from an airplane, and that these would be cut with water. Actually, they'd be cut when you sprayed it too, and there was a formula for how much DDT compared to how much water, and you'd have the spraying equipment, and you'd have to have a little more DDT from the granules that you'd put in the airplane. And so my dad did that some, I also mentioned him using the helicopter the last time we had seed corn, and that was called forcing pollination. I think that was what you called it. And it had something to do with it needing to get the pollination done in a hurry, having something to do with the way that the tassels were coming out. Either they were coming out too fast or something. Anyway, it needed to be, the corn needed to be pollinated rapidly, and the way you could do that would be with a helicopter. And when I looked that up, I found that my mother was 77 when she went riding in the helicopter for that final ride and enjoyed it. So there was one thing that I'd said that, and I mentioned to you the soybeans. Let's see, I put a little orange on some of these. Returning to corn kernels, we talked about the corn kernels that were invented in the farm. And I should mention that Claire Matthews, who invented them, had studied agronomy at the university before he came down to the farm, had some sort of degree from there. And what made him start to even try to do anything with the cow feed is he was the herdsman. He saw what went into the mouths of the cows. He saw what came out the other end in the gutters, and he saw that a lot of the grain was undigested. And he thought there must be a way of making that grain more digestible. Well, there were rolling mills that you could buy, but these were very expensive. They would flatten the grain. And he said, well, I ought to be able to figure something out that'll make the grain more digestible without buying a great huge flattening mill. And so he invented this thing with a wagon wheel and a skein, and with a furrow on it, and when you dropped the thing in the skein and turned it and it came funneling through, the friction semi-cooked the grain, but it also broke it down so that it was easily chewed by any of us that were up there on the barn floor, and by the animals too. And then, you know, we all ate it, and then somebody took it home, not one of us, I think, and boiled it up so that it was thoroughly cooked, and then put salt and cheese on it. And that was these little curly things they called colettes. Those were the corn kernels. Well, this seemed like a good thing. Everybody liked them, and so that's when he decided that he was going to quit working on the farm, or he decided part-time to do it. And he needed some capital, and so he went in, and this was in the early 30s. He went into business with somebody who put up some money, and they made rabbit feed. They took alfalfa flakes for rabbit feed. So the beginning of it was rabbit feed. And then it turned into the corn kernels for people to eat, and two other people got in on it, Adamses. And the Adamses gradually managed to buy controlling stock in it, and made it nationwide, international. They finally sold out to Beatrice Foods. But the Flake-All Corporation turned into corn kernels, turned into whatever. And Claire felt bitter about it. He felt he'd been cheated out of his invention. Oh, he'd gone to the Chicago World's Fair, and here was one of these great big mills. And he said, I've made one of those, and you can put it on a card table. And so at the Chicago World's Fair, they moved his little machine alongside this great big one, which might have been what started some of the interest of others in it. And but Dad said, he said he didn't know as Claire had too much to be bitter about. He said the invention gave him a good living all his life, and for him and his kids. And so the Adamses became millionaires, and Claire didn't. But and he said I might have said he used to enjoy going, and he would say to Claire every now and then, because he kept on Claire living in one of the houses, one of the tenant houses that he had, and giving him free milk. And every now and then he would say, don't you think you should give me a little bit of what's going on? And so Claire would give him a little bit of stock, and Dad ended up with 3% of the stock. And that paid off very nicely for a while until he finally sold it to the Adamses. But as I said, every year we'd get a nice big box all full of all the snack foods that the corn kernel had transmogrified into all these things. And there really wasn't anything before that except potato chips and potato chips and popcorn were the snack foods. And now we have this huge snack food industry. So I wanted to clear up how he did that, and about the World's Fair. The Flake-All Corporation in 1933, and then it went worldwide. So I mentioned about that. I told you that I'd gotten a little more detail on bloat. Anything else here that's circled? Maybe those are the main things that I remembered that I hadn't said or had said wrong. Okay. Now you're saying something else.
Well, I wanted to know what your opinion was on the future of the family farms now.
I think that with the way the world is going right now, that there's going to be a place for the family farm. I think it's probably sort of hit the nadir, and that now with people wanting to know where their food is grown, with this operation that's up here in Caledonia, and other such operations, with the growth of our own farmers market here in Springfield, which is bigger every year, more and more people wanting to get their food locally, know where it's grown. I heard something interesting though on the radio where it says that it isn't necessarily making more carbon footprint to get your food from somewhere far away, because it depends on what it costs to grow it over there. You were talking about New Zealand in particular, that if New Zealand is doing this and this and this, it might be cheaper to get a New Zealand apple than to get one from Washington State or something like that. But I think I think that the green movement has caught on, and it's small yet, but it's growing. And I think a year ago, 6 months ago, if you said carbon footprint, would somebody look at you, what are you talking about? Now, if you say carbon footprint, I think almost everybody would know what you're talking about, or maybe it's just the people I'm with. But I think that there is a place for the small farm, and also I think people are realizing that the kind of living that they've been doing has not been making them particularly happy, and that to get your hands in the dirt and to raise a chicken or a pig or something like that, whether the family farm is going to be a paying proposition, I would guess that you almost have to do something like John Peterson is doing in Caledonia to make it pay at this point, although there are farmers still in Turtle Township that are small farms and that are making it. They're milking, they're selling their milk to the condenseries. Milk is hugely expensive right now, but I don't know how much of it the farmer is getting. I think it's more and more middlemen, and I think that there'd be more hope for the family farm if there was less middleman. But at this point, people are getting more, in this country at any rate, and a certain class of people are getting more and more and more concerned about what they eat. And I forget where I heard this story, but I heard it fairly recently, where it might have been from a daughter, might have been from somebody I was talking to, where somebody was saying, well, with all of this and this and this and this, you know, going on with our processed food, and it's the processed food that's using the petroleum, that's using the thing, that is putting the fat in, that's using the high fructose corn syrup, which nobody should be eating and all that. This person said, well, what can we eat? And this person pondered a moment and said, water. Well, even water you're not so sure of anymore. But I think that the awareness is going to grow, and with the awareness is going to be the desire for people to know what they're eating, know where it's grown, and to get their own hands in it too. I've got this garden next door that Mr. Ferry has. That's been his life's dream, and now he bought up when that house got torn down, he bought the land and he's made himself a wonderful garden. This is February. I'm still eating a few of the tomatoes that I picked when they were green. They're not very good anymore, but I'm trying to see how long I can keep a tomato that's still edible. I think I have 4 or 5 that are sort of wizened, but they haven't gone bad yet. But I'm not any expert on this. This morning on NPR, when I came back from swimming, they were talking about the big recall of meat. A lot of people are realizing that the cow is not a practical animal. the amount of methane it gives out, the amount of grass it eats, the amount of grain that it consumes in order to turn into beef. We're a great beef eater country, but I think there are more and more vegetarians or more and more people that are cutting back on their meat. Now, if you're going to go to fish, then we've got a huge problem with the oceans, but I won't go into that right now. But on NPR this morning, they were talking about this big recall of all this meat that was going into school lunches. And the person that was discussing it was saying, well, the meat didn't go straight into the school lunches the way it came, but that it would go into something sticks, beef sticks or what they would call them. I forget what they'd call them, or into crumbles of this or this or this. Anyway, they would be processed. And the person finished this by saying that she thought that many more people were wanting now to have their kids eat stuff without being processed on their school lunch plates. And schools, I think, are becoming aware of that. You're getting schools that are trying to get rid of the vending machines that are filling kids up with unhealthy snacks and sugary high fructose drinks or substitute sort of things to give them real calories instead of empty calories. I think there's an awareness coming. I don't know. I haven't talked about this really with anybody. That's a fresh question to me. For me to be asked, oops, here we are. For me to be asked what I see as the future of the family farm. But in talking to my friends in Turtle Township, they seem to think that the danger is over as far as Beloit coming out any further. They've said, here's the line that we have drawn, that we have agreed on. And from here on, we're going to be able to keep on farming. And in the places that I've been around in Rock County, there's still a lot of farming going on. I know that there's places that suddenly want to come in with a huge hog farm, and there's a lot of letters pro and con in the paper, and people saying this is the wave of the future. You got to raise farm animals like factory things, and other people are saying you don't have to, and this sort of thing. I'll be interested in thinking more about that question and talking more with other people about it.
And I have
It's terrible to have it go. And actually in that 1929 thing by Duffy, what he was saying was this will of course result in the loss of some farm homes by making the farm more efficient, by having, I mean that was way back in 1929. Well, that wouldn't have made Grandpa happy at all, but there were other parts of the letter where he said, he was talking about having, Duffy was talking about having to consolidate some farms to make better use. I mean, heck, England with its little postage stamp fields, each surrounded with a wonderful hedgerow, which has been there for hundreds of years. They've been tearing those out because you can't use farm machinery on a postage stamp. And so Dorset doesn't look like it used to look. And Oxfordshire doesn't look like it used to look. But I think they're realizing too that there's a value to the hedgerows and to the smaller things there too. And so they're not going into monstrous farming. Or I hope they're not.
That's an interesting question. We'll find out the answer.
Mm-hmm. But Duffy was already saying this will lose some family farms back in 1929, but then his experiment didn't work. So at least it didn't work on the Dogan farm.
I have one last question that I like to ask everybody, and this is kind of your time to shine and leave a little lasting memory in this interview, because this interview is going to be, around forever, and it'll be something that's archived, and you have grandkids that are running around and things like that. And what's the one thing that when they stumble upon this interview, what's the one thing that you want them to find in this tape? Or the one thing you want them to remember?
Well, if I've said anything disparaging about them, I hope they won't find that. Or about any of my family members. I think that what I would want it to be is what is the message of the big book, which would be the message of these interviews too, which is that it was a wonderfully rewarding and enriching life to grow up. We've talked a little about the community, but the farm community that I grew up in, we had a town community too, but there was also the farm community and the township and all of that, which is pretty much lost now. There's some, but the get-togethers and the different things that went on that tied a community together. I think I would want my kids and grandkids to realize that even if this way of life is gone, you still need to build community. You still need to find communities where you can, where you're not just a cipher or alone in something. I think my daughter Ellie left Chicago because she was working at a job that she did very well in, but she didn't have any community. And if you have friends, they're here and they're way over there, and you can't get together with them. And I think the church has been a strong community, but has become much less so. We are not near as much a church-going nation, unless you count the Bible Belt type, which are increasing. And in fact, those churches I don't know if they're communities or not, but they're becoming almost factories with thousands of people, in those great tabernacles or whatever you want to call them. So what am I saying? I'm saying that what I was fortunate enough to grow up in, and which my editor says about the book, which was also about the life, it's, there's nothing like it before and won't be again. Well, there was like it before in that there were the farms and things, but by pulling it all together and putting it down, you're not going to really return to retail home delivery. You're not going to really return to small farms doing pioneering work in scientific things. Scientific things take too much money and expertise and beyond PhDs to understand these things and so forth. I mean, what small farmer could have begun to figure out the genome, that sort of thing. And yet, figuring out the genome is going to have a big effect on breeding and on disease and on everything. Knowing how people have spread around the world, we're learning that from the genome and where you all came from. So I think I would want them to realize that it was a wonderful life, that you can that you need community, but that we are losing community and we are losing too many things because we have not been aware and we have not pushed, and we're going to have to push our governments. I may have said earlier that the population has to stop. We have to slow down our population. We have to stabilize the Earth's population because we simply cannot support that. And it's either going to happen because we take steps to limit population, or we're going to have catastrophes of the nature of the flu that came. And I mean, look at all those birds they killed over there in China when the birds got the bird flu and so forth. Well, if we have, what the word is now is that it's not a question of whether there's going to be a pandemic. It's just a question of when. And are we going to be ready for it? And what sort of pandemic? Is it going to be a flu pandemic? Is it going to be what? You don't know. They seem to be getting, see, I'm talking much too long on your final question. I feel a certain amount of cynicism about whether us, the human race, has the ability to save ourselves. And yet I see ourselves on the brink of losing everything. When there isn't enough to eat, and there won't be, probably even more important is there's not going to be enough water. The Colorado River ends in a trickle into a sandbank or something. It doesn't even get to Mexico. Poor Mexico has lost the Colorado River. The big wars of this century are going to be over who gets water and food. And do we have the foresight and willing to give up the good things we have now in the way of being taxed or using foresight in order to preserve what we have for everybody? And the word now, and that's another word that you wouldn't have heard a few years ago, which is sustainable. I would want them to see that what we had was in some ways sustainable, but in other ways we were busy using, petroleum products and expanding, and we were living the good life. But everybody was. That's what we were growing up into. And it's only been recently that, although I've got some stuff, I read an ancient Christmas card to my folks. By ancient, I mean it was around the 50s. And one of their friends was writing, and what she was writing, and I don't think I saved it, but I should have. She was putting all her energy into what we would now call sustainability, working for that sort of thing, because she was seeing quite far ahead. So I would hope that my grandchildren and all looking at this would take hope from it and say, we can do something. My grandfather, for instance, increased the amount of tillable good soil by careful farming practices. We got rid of that gully. We improved, what was the word, the tilth, or whatever it was. And I know that Darwin did experiments with earthworms at the end of his life, watching how their castings were coming up and so forth. Well, you can go a lot faster than earthworms if you do it right. And so I think that we need to try to breed up our children, raise up our children, to use a more humane term, to be responsible, caring, loving citizens who are willing to say us rather than me, and be inclusive, to say we are going to pull everybody up together and keep us from going down the drain. But I see some of these houses that are still going up. I don't know how anybody can live in a house that big, or spend that much on it. I don't know. It's tell me what else. Is that it?
Well, that was great. That was great, Jack.
It's sort of awkwardly said, and if I had more time to think about it, I think they'd want him to say, "Hey, she was a pretty neat grandma." I wouldn't mind him saying that. and as I've said, like Miss Egan, boy, I wish I'd known her. The great-grandchildren that unless Cressy has a child pretty soon, I've got what, another 10 years, another 15 years at the most. I won't know my great-grandchildren, except maybe as little kids, very little. And with Rachel and Wyatt, who are 7 and 5 now, I think that I'll know them well into their teens, so that'll be good. But I've also recognized in doing all this research that I've done of the people that I haven't known and how I would have liked to have known them, and and the questions, I kept asking Dad and Mother and all these people afterwards, once I got going on this, all sorts of questions. But I'm finding so many things now that I wish I'd asked them, and that I didn't know to ask them at the time. And what I've been trying to do when you talked about my teaching is I've been trying in my writing classes to get students to do what I'm doing, which is to do these kinds of investigations and to find out from people the things they want to know while those people are still around, and for the benefits of their own family and their children and grandchildren. And that's another hopeful thing I see, which is that people have become much more interested in their antecedents, which means they're also much more interested in their futures. because they're trying to preserve their antecedents for the benefit of their own kids. If this had been going on when I was 15 and I saw people doing it, I might have asked Grandpa the right questions. Somebody might have suggested to me, why don't you ask Grandpa? I did have the sense to write down a few of the family stories at that point, but that's about as far as I got.